going to very briefly cover what I'm saying is what is authentication phishing, really just to sort of show where things were before and how this differentiates from that. And then we'll move on to the main crux of the talk, which is what is authorization phishing, how's it different, and then we'll look at the main techniques that I'm sort of saying fall under this banner. So there's consent phishing, we'll spend a little bit of time on that, but the main focus will be on device code phishing and consent fix, which are the things that have taken off a lot more in the last year. We'll also then kind of look at if you're talking about a Microsoft setup, how conditional access policies kind of work in regard to this, and then we'll look at sort of what the future of this vector might be and a little bit of advice for defenders. So first of all, like, what is the authentication phishing, which I'm differentiating from? Well, of course, if you go back to really classic old school phishing, it's just basic cred harvesting. When we had single factor, that's what it was. We then switched to kind of like early MFA methods, and then we started seeing things like SIM swapping attacks and MFA fatigue attacks to sort of bypass some of these approaches. Then when we kind of switched to kind of more authenticator-driven apps that required a verification code as well, we started to get full-blown attacker-in-the-middle phishing, which is really common now. So like a reverse proxy setup using things like EvilJinx would be an example of an open source tool for it. And that was used to steal tokens and bypass MFA. And then the sort of where we are today as people are migrating to passkeys, which is designed to sort of prevent against this, we've got kind of MFA downgrade attacks aimed at trying to ensure that attacker-in-the-middle phishing attacks can still apply to passkey protected accounts where backup methods are available. So that's kind of the progression we've seen and what I'm talking about in terms of authenticating phishing. So I'll just show quickly what I mean by this as a kind of fairly current example. So I'll use attacker-in-the-middle phishing using EvilJinx, but we'll also do a slightly more modern twist on it where we're going to look at a passkey protected account and using a downgrade attack to conduct that. So in this case, I've got EvilJinx on the right, and I've got my victim on the left. First of all, I'm just going to show you a normal login with my account, just to show you how I've got it set up. I have a full passwordless setup with a YubiKey on my laptop, so sort of full hardware-based passkey. That's how I normally log in for this account, right? But with Microsoft, if you add a passkey, it doesn't invalidate your older authentication methods, and that goes for a lot of apps out there. And even at the enterprise level, it's very common to see policies for the people that have started migrating to passkeys to still support backup methods, because the larger you get, the more operational problems you can sometimes get with passkeys if someone breaks a device or loses a device or whatever. So it's quite common to see backup methods still supported. But of course, like anything in this space, like we used to see with like SSL downgrade attacks or other similar things, if an attacker can force you into the less secure version, then an attack is still viable. So let's look at a basic sort of email-based delivery vector for, say, an EvilJinx attacker-in-the-middle phishing attack targeting this account. Normally, we'll see with almost every browser attack we see now, there's always some kind of anti-bot gateway that's kind of designed to deal with email-based solutions and a bunch of other sort of common threat gateways. But then we go past that and we get into the EvilJinx part. So here's the reverse proxy technique going on. It's going to present a Microsoft login page to the user. We're tracking that on the right. Now I enter my email address at this point, and what would happen in the response that comes back from Microsoft is it would normally say, hey, Luke normally uses a passkey to log in, so it kind of default to that method. In this case, my custom fishlet for EvilJinx is messing around with the communications, basically intercepting it and changing it and saying, no, Luke likes to use a password, then an authenticator app. And so at this point, we've effectively done the downgrade, and we've just turned it into a classic attacker-in-the-middle phishing attack. So I do my password, I then go to my authenticator app and validate that. And because Microsoft is configured to still allow this as a method, then the attack works. So of course, we've captured my password there. That's not actually as important. It's the authorization tokens that we've intercepted here, effectively the cookies for the session, which is your classic attacker-in-the-middle phishing attack. So with EvilJinx, we can then take those cookies, we can then go to our own browser, and we can effectively use those things to hijack the session. So I'm just using like a basic extension that enables easy cookie clearing and importing. So I import those things, I then refresh the connection, and I'm into the account. So that's like the sort of current sort of state of the art really of authentication phishing. Attacker-in-the-middle phishing is super common. We see it with lots of different criminal kits. EvilJinx is just an easy thing to demo. I'm using it because there's an open source framework for doing that. There's lots of criminal kits out there that do that, and it still works if you're using passkeys if there's backup methods enabled. So the state of this right now is that, at least in terms of the attacks I see sort of daily, it's probably just about still the number one vector in terms of a plurality that we see. But the other two most common attacks we see alongside it are device code phishing, which we're going to talk about today, also click fix. That's not part of this presentation, but that's become very common in the last year or two as well. But where it used to be dominant, it's now the most common of multiple options, but it's it may go down a little, and we may see others increase. And ultimately, it's been tuned pretty well to be effective right now. It's been around a few years. The criminal kits have got very good at this. But also, as time goes on, it's going to get harder as more and more people migrate to passkeys. And if people put in very strict configs that don't allow the attack that I just did, it'll get harder. So from an attacker's perspective, what do? They can either keep focusing on the less secure organizations or start focusing on less secure targets, so like moving away from the core IDPs and maybe, like the Microsofts and Googles and Oktas and so forth, and start targeting other vendors that may not have made a stricter passkey adoption. Or they can find another approach. And I think that's where we've seen them sort of diversify, and that's kind of the crux of this talk. So what do I mean when I say authorization phishing? I say I'm kind of introducing this as a bit of an umbrella term for a few different things we've seen. But ultimately, I'm talking about something that is post-auth, and therefore there's no passwords needed. There's no reason to bypass MFA. Passkeys don't do anything because it's really attacking a different layer. And the three things I think fit inside this quite nicely at the moment is consent phishing, device code phishing, and consent fix. So consent phishing's been around quite a while. We don't actually see it that commonly now. I'll come to this in a sec. But ultimately, it's kind of integrating malicious OAuth apps and granting permissions into your account rather than compromising the authentication flow. Device code phishing is using the OAuth device code flow to effectively approve access to another device. And again, that's kind of post-auth in that case. And then consent fix is a pretty interesting technique we discovered in the wild, being used for targeted attacks like the end of last year. But ultimately, it's kind of like a clever social engineering technique to get someone to give you their OAuth tokens. So I'll start with consent phishing. I'm only going to spend a little bit of time on this. But yeah, ultimately, I kind of partly said this before, it's allowing some sort of attacker-controlled third-party app access into your account and in your app tenant. Typically involves an attacker creating a malicious OAuth app on one of their tenants and then sending out links that do it. And you'll get something like this. Like on the left is a Microsoft example, on the right is a GitHub example. Anything that supports this is potentially viable for it. And if the attacker approves the access, then they've kind of got persistent access into your account at the sort of authorization layer rather than having requiring to circumvent authentication. So I guess why don't we see it that much now? Like it has happened in the past, it's been around a while. The reason I think we don't see it so much is that I think it's quite difficult to scale to the sort of criminal kit level at the moment. Over the years, a lot of the sort of vendors have put in various controls to make it more difficult. Like in particular with Microsoft, eventually they required admin approval for any new apps into a tenant that asked for certain sensitive scopes effectively. They've all done different things, but also even if you can get around that, the first time someone discovers a malicious app being used for this, it's really easy for the major vendors to then like block that entire app completely. They can ban that entire OAuth app. They can even ban the entire tenant associated with it. In terms of like doing that, say for Microsoft, you might have had to set up a Microsoft business account and get a new tenant up to register a new app. So I think a big part of it is just that once it's burnt pretty bad. It's not as easy to rotate as like domains and IP addresses and the kind of things we see with other phishing attacks. So I feel like maybe it's more, for more targeted attacks, maybe it's a little bit more viable still, but I just think it's probably more costly in economic terms to try to scale it to the criminal kit level compared with other techniques. It's very much an opinion, but that's why I think we probably don't see it as much. But where's that led us? And that's, okay, so like, if connecting your own app is hard now, what about apps that are already approved? And that's really where device code phishing and consent fix come in. So device code phishing, ultimately it targets like first-party apps that are already consented in the user's tenant, or at least often first-party apps. It's been around actually quite a while, at least since 2021. It was kind of very much in the red team community. There's been some great researchers that did early work on this. I think I first came across it in either 2022 or 2023, and I do remember at the time thinking, wow, I don't know, this seems a bit crazy that you can do this, and why isn't this widely exploited, because it's very powerful. A few years later, this did happen. But yeah, ultimately, instead of asking for a password or MFA or anything, the attackers are presenting you a code as the victim and asking you to enter it back, and this exploits the OAuth device code flow. And we've seen like at least 30 kits this year, which would have been unprecedented in the past, because basically, another point, threat actors out there are vibe coding new kits very quickly now compared to how we used to see things in years before. But ultimately, yeah, this kind of went from 0 to 100 in like Feb this year, and it's really, really powerful. So, like, what is device code auth that it exploits? It was effectively originally intended for like input constrained devices. So you need to have your account on like a smart TV or a printer or a VoIP phone or something. You can't necessarily easily log in with a long complex password or use a YubiKey associated. You might have used this yourself actually. Smart TVs may be one of the more common ones where rather than logging that device, it shows you a code, and you can go to your phone or your laptop or something and enter that, and effectively it's a way of approving a different device access into your account, and that's what's been exploited as a phishing vector. In practice, there's some other legit cases that have kind of come out of this. It's actually quite commonly used in certain sort of DevOps chains, like for a lot of command line tools and PowerShell and dev SDKs and that kind of thing. So that's kind of like the legit use of it. But in terms of the phishing, like what happens is the victim will land on a phishing page. It could be email, but actually a lot of the time these days we see a lot of different delivery vectors, like social media vectors, malvertising, compromised sites. So there's a huge amount of vectors for these kind of attacks now. But however they get there, they end up on some sort of phishing site, and they effectively the page will poll for a new code, and it will present that to the user so that it's fresh and ready when they arrive on the page. And then if they complete the authorization for that, then the attacker will gain access to OAuth tokens to gain a compromise of their account. Now, in cases like Microsoft, there are certain cases where you can actually escalate further. I'm going to show this in a sec. But you can sometimes exchange those tokens for a full primary refresh token and gain an actual fully interactive SSO-enabled login as well. But the principal access is kind of more API-driven compromise. So I'm going to show you first of all a criminal kit, and then we're going to look at a sort of side-by-side so you can see the back end. So we've tracked at least 30 kits this year. One of the things we've seen is that all the threat actors that had existing attacker in the middle phishing kits have gradually introduced device code phishing kits as well. This one happens to be, we think, by the same authors of Tycoon 2FA. They were a little bit later in the, to implementing this, but they made their own one eventually too. One other thing I'm going to show you with this is that I'm going to show you a scenario where the user is not already logged into their Microsoft account in this. That's actually the rarer case. Most of the time people are already logged in. I'm only kind of doing this because I've got it set up for a passkey, and I just want to sort of explicitly show how a passkey doesn't make any difference for this. But we'll see the more common scenario after. So I go to the malicious URL. This one is using like so you've got your anti-bot gateway that they all have. Then this one's using like a voicemail lure. So you click to copy the code, and it makes a pop-up here. And the important thing with device code phishing is that obviously you can see there's a malicious worker devs domain at the top, but in the pop-up that is legit Microsoft. We are talking properly to Microsoft there because they are doing a legit device code auth to Microsoft. So at this point they put the code in, they click next. They click to select their account. We're not logged in this case. I select to go and use my YubiKey as a passkey to log in. But that's outside of the attacking part. Then we just have to click to say, oh, we're trying to sign into the Microsoft Authentication Broker. There's various apps you can use for this. And then at that point, the compromise has been achieved. The criminal kit in this case is just redirecting you to Outlook, so it seems like everything went to plan and you end up on legit Microsoft, but behind the scenes, they've compromised the OAuth tokens. And also you can see from a general user's perspective, there's nothing really that seems that malicious about that. It doesn't trigger any kind of normal warning signs about entering passwords or downloading strange files and executing them. So what does this look like behind the scenes? Now, like with the authentication phishing, I showed you EvilJinx, right? I wasn't going to write my own tool because EvilJinx already exists. With this, in terms of like the modern criminal kits, the way they work for this, there's not really a good open source toolkit that I'm aware of at the moment to demonstrate that. But because we've seen this year an explosion in vibe coding of new kits, and so a massive increase in the number of new kits and frequency of them, I just did the same thing and Claude coded up my own. So this is exactly what the attackers are doing. This is a device code phishing kit and an admin panel for that on the right. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. We get, some sort of phishing email in this case. Keep it simple. Something that looks a little bit like before. We're doing a sort of document sharing lure. They click the code. We're tracking their progress through that on the right on our admin panel. They enter it. We're already logged into our Microsoft account in this case, so I just click to verify which account I want to use, and that's it. That is the compromise. It's that simple. So you can see why this is so powerful. Now, on the left, we then do something similar. We say, oh, okay, thanks for confirming your access. Here's your document, and then they move on with their day. But for us, we've compromised all their OAuth tokens here. Now, we've got API-driven access, so you kind of have to then implement the post-exploitation parts yourself. I've put some common ones in here, like viewing emails and files. This is a test account with really boring emails, but you can see that I've got access to them. If I switch to OneDrive, we've got the OneDrive files there. I've uploaded a PDF here, and you can browse that, or you can go and download it offline. You can kind of do whatever you want to do through Microsoft's Graph API, but you just got to implement it. However, it would be nice if we got a fully interactive login like we do with attacker middle phishing. And in the case of Microsoft, it's sometimes possible to do that. So that Microsoft authentication broker I used before was an app selected for a reason. And that's because it has access to the device registration service. And therefore, I can register a new virtual device and associate it with this user's account through the API. I can then re-authenticate as that and gain a fully interactive primary refresh token. So I'm going to click this button that does that under the hood, and now it's given me a new refresh token. I'm going to copy that, and a little bit like I did previously with EvilJinx, I'm going to go and load this new cookie into my browser, refresh, and we're going to find that we are into the account. Now, in principle, this is just an easier way of gaining access to things rather than writing API calls, right? We can go and browse interactively, but where the important distinction lies is that this is SSO enabled, so I can use it to laterally move to other apps. So I pick anything here. I picked Atlassian as a random example, right? But if I go to Atlassian and I go and say, I want to do an OIDC-based SSO logging as my Microsoft account, Microsoft thinks I'm already logged in, right? So I just click to confirm that, and now I've moved laterally to another app. So that's the kind of real use of kind of escalating your privileges in that way. But even if we don't do that, obviously full API-driven graph access into a Microsoft account is pretty powerful anyway. Now, a lot of this talk is focused on Microsoft as target. Most of these attacks, though, are not limited to Microsoft. It's just the classic case of Microsoft always gets targeted first because, it's sort of biggest vendor and so forth for businesses. Anything that supports a device code auth flow is technically vulnerable. So we're going to look at GitHub as an example here. Now, OAuth in itself is actually pretty ubiquitous across the internet. It's used by countless numbers of apps. To be fair, the device code flow is much more rarely implemented, but when it is implemented, it tends to be the pretty juicy big tech vendors that do it. Hence, I'm using GitHub as another example. So OAuth is kind of like a bit of a standard. You've kind of got a little bit of flexibility in how you implement it, but obviously it's going to look and feel pretty similar. So we're using like a dev-focused lure here about sharing a VS Code tunnel, but you're going to see how similar this looks as we go through it. We're already signed in with our GitHub account. This is a legit github.com address. The difference is here, this looks a little bit more like consent phishing, where we're actually being asked to authorize something. In this case, we are pretending to be the Visual Studio Code app for GitHub, and so we are approving access for that. And same thing, once we've done that, it's very similar to how it was with Microsoft. We've approved that access. We've now compromised the account. From a post-exploitation standpoint, obviously, GitHub is a pretty powerful account. There's lots of things you can do. For a proof of concept, I'm just going to show you private repo access. So this is a test account. I've made a private repo in it. If I was to click and access this in the browser, obviously it's going to 404. However, we've got the access tokens to access it. I'm going to copy this git clone command, bring up a terminal, and we can then just git clone the repo like we would legitimately normally. Obviously, we could then like I'm just going to cat a file, but we could make commits, push it back, do whatever. So it's pretty powerful, as you can see. And yeah, it's really, it's not Microsoft specific. It's just anything that supports the OAuth device code flow is theoretically vulnerable, at least. It depends what other controls have been put in place by the vendor. So that's device code phishing. Now we're going to look at consent fix. This was a really interesting one. So this is a case of something like device code phishing was a red team thing for years, and then one day got used by real world threat actors. This is the opposite. I discovered this in the wild at the end of last year. Other people have since said it was Russia, I don't know. But it's not me saying that, but I found the attack, and it was very interesting. We found effectively a bunch of different websites that were compromised, and it was a little bit like ClickFix. They were putting a fake Cloudflare turnstile at the beginning, but instead of a ClickFix attack where it got you to try to run some malicious command, it was asking you to enter an email address. And it took us a while of seeing a few before we were able to get it to activate fully, and it seemed targeted on certain emails. Most of the time it would just say thanks and move on and do nothing, but if you put the right email address in, it would execute this second stage where it had this little video and told you to open this thing in a new tab and to copy and paste the URL in to verify. And ultimately what it's doing is stealing the OAuth code. And normally, for many apps, the code wouldn't be enough on its own because it would be protected by a client secret as well. But for public client apps, things for native apps, they can't be protected in that way. So that code alone is enough. And yeah, in a way, it's like really sneaky and clever, and in a way, it's like just breathtakingly simple and obvious. But it was in the wild, and yeah, and we found it. So I'm going to show you an example of one of the sites we saw. So it was some of them were like legit sites compromised. This one seemed like it might have just been vibe coded and seeded, because it was a very strange site. But people were just coming across this on Google, basically. We detected it across a few customers. They get to the site, and it would come up. This is very much like ClickFix, except this is what happened instead. And if you put in the correct email address that it wanted to target, then you would get this. And then it would tell you, oh, you're going to have to click this button and go and copy and paste this thing. And what they'd set up a first-party app to do a redirect to localhost, and then we're telling you to effectively copy and paste that and put it back in here, and they gain access that way. So it seems a bit convoluted in a way, but it's actually really, really sneaky. I don't know if consent fix was the best name. I was under a bit of time pressure when we came up with it, so it's done now, sorry. I think someone else suggested auth code fix afterwards, which maybe would have been better, but it's too late. Now, interestingly, so I'm just doing a shout out here because I'm about to steal John Hammond's technique. So I thought I'd credit him first. He saw this and did a whole video about it, and also his video explains it really, really well. So if you're interested in this, go and check out his video anyway. But after he saw my blog post, he did this, and then he made a slight improvement to the attack that we'd seen in the wild, where rather than copy and pasting, you could do a little pop-up, a little bit like device code phishing, and then encourage them to just drag the URL bar to it, which from a social engineering perspective makes it a little bit slicker. So for my demo, I'm now stealing his improvement. So I've done basically the same thing as I did with device code phishing. I've vibe coded up into our panel to do consent fix now, so you can see what it looks like on the back end. I'm using a DocuSign law this time, another common social engineering vector we see. So I've made my own little, or Claude made my own little video there showing what to do, and you get this pop-up, and in this case I'm emulating the Teams app and using a Teams-based callback, and when you drag and drop it like that, that's what happens, that's the compromise. So when I go here, similar to before, I've got access to the Graph API now. I can go and access emails. Similar thing to device code phishing. So you can see that's really powerful too. Now the other reason I brought up John Hammond is because he also then tipped me off about this. So he called his version Consent Fix v2, like slight improvement. I'm guessing these threat actors must have seen his video because they released this and called it Consent Fix v3. This is for sale on some criminal forums now, as of, I can't remember now, a few months ago, he let me know. I've not knowingly seen it really in the wild yet. I'm sure it's being used to some extent, but maybe it's just like not at the scale of device code phishing and attack and middle phishing yet. I feel like it's just a matter of time. But yeah, there are kits out there, and there was whole like long videos showing how it works, and these forum posts. So it's definitely getting weaponized to some extent. So yeah, I think it was a pretty high-grade threat actor that had kind of found this as like a zero-day technique and was abusing it until I first saw it. and then, like anything, it's going to trickle down and end up in the more general criminal ecosystem eventually. So, whenever I'm talking about this, whether I'm talking about attacker in the middle phishing or these newer authorization phishing attacks, a common question I get, at least with regards to the Microsoft, is always, but what about conditional access? We've got conditional access policies, so it should all be fine. I always used to just say, well, yeah, they can help, but it's so configuration dependent. But I thought, for the sake of this, I'd at least test some common scenarios to see what, to at least give some idea of what the impact is. And it's a bit like saying, if you say, oh, I use conditional access, it's a bit like saying I use a firewall. It's like, well, what is your environment like? What's the config? But at least, in a lab environment, you can validate some things. So I thought the most common ones that would probably apply here and that people have asked me about were these four. So the first is like require phishing resistant auth. Great thing to do if you get to that stage. It will stop that passkey downgrade attack that I mentioned earlier, but it's basically irrelevant to this whole authorization phishing umbrella because it's defending against something different. This is all post-authentication. One other newer one they've introduced since device code phishing took off is they've made a particular option in the policies now where you can explicitly identify device code flows, and then you can combine it with other things, but effectively you can just block device code flows. I'm not going to really demonstrate that here because it does just do what it says on the tin. Like if you set that up, it will stop a device code flow from working, subject to whatever you've applied it to. But the two more interesting ones in this case really are require compliant device, and there's a few ways of doing that with different things. And then the one that's probably not in much use, to be fair yet, because it's still in preview, but token protection. Now, a couple of other things regarding this that I didn't really explicitly test. Continuous access evaluation, I kind of 50% tested this because it used to be something that was in preview and then it came out. It's enabled by default now, and it really just, it means that it will check tokens more frequently, and if it wants to invalidate something, it will happen much more quickly than waiting for an access token to expire and blocking the refresh like it used to. So that doesn't really help in any of these scenarios beyond changing the timelines. You can also make explicit policies with it related to location enforcement, but that's kind of a bit of a different thing, and that just comes into generally how you configure location enforcement, if you do. So it's a little bit outside of this, so I kind of left that. The other thing is people have recommended for consent fix specifically around, you can do some defenses against it in terms of all the different apps people use for it, like making specific service principals and tightly managing user groups that have access to them. I do believe if you go through the effort of doing all that stuff, you can lock it down a lot more. But it's just, again, it gets a lot more detailed, and I think it's much rarer people have done this, so I didn't really look at that side. But the two things that were a little bit more binary on or off and are more common that people ask about are the compliant device and token protection things. So my test configuration for this is effectively these four things I created, and I just applied to one specific account. Now, I tried to create these from templates that other people would likely use to begin with to make it more common. There was really only two of them that this applied to, though. The phishing resistant auth one, which by default is only for admins, but obviously you can change that. I applied it to my user. But also the compliant device ones here. Now, this is where it's a bit interesting because there's three different options. The strictest one is in preview currently on the right. I assume not many people are using that one yet. I assume most people, if they are using this, will have started, if they haven't custom made the template, they will have used either of the first two as a base. Now, the interesting thing here is that if you don't change those, they don't really help too much with this attack anyway, because if you look at the first one, it's by default only applied to admins, so you're obviously not going to protect most of your accounts if you aren't changing that. The other one, though, that applies to all users is an OR criteria. So it's saying that people have to either come from a compliant device or use MFA, which means that, again, like that doesn't really protect against anything then, because you're kind of saying as long as one is satisfied, then it's okay. For my case, I made it so that I used the first one as the template, but I just applied it specifically to my low privileged account. So I'm saying that you have to come from a compliant device. It doesn't matter whether you're using MFA. Now, for this first one, if I go back here and say for the first demo I'm going to show you, the first three of these are enabled, but I don't have token protection enabled yet, and I'm going to come back to that with all four enabled after. So for a require compliant device thing, this is effectively what I've got configured in this case. Now, this does effectively kind of block device code flows, but it's not really specifically blocking the phishing. It seems to just be that device code flows aren't compatible with compliant devices more generally. So yes, it blocks the phishing, and then this is the other thing. I think if you are using legit device code flows, then a blanket require compliant device might create you problems. So you would have to make some exceptions if that's the case, and then you need to understand what level of additional attack surface you've made there. But I've just got it blanket applied for this, and I found it stopped the device code phishing, but it doesn't stop consent fix. So I'm just going to show you that now. So we've got, at this point, we've got require phishing resistant auth, we've got block device code flows, we've got require compliant device enabled. I'm going to show you the device code phishing example first. So we put in our code, we pick our account, and you can say, hey, it was successful, but this is supposed to come from a managed device, effectively. So it's blocked that in that case. However, if we go and switch to our consent fix example, I go through this, and you'll see that it doesn't matter in this case. We bring it up, we do our drag and drop, and we've got the compromise deal. So, it's a good thing to have, of course, and compliant device requirements also are really good for attack and middle phishing. It provides a lot of mitigation there too, but at least doesn't seem to apply to consent fix right now. Okay, so now I'm going to move to having them all on, including token protection, which is currently in preview. This actually works better than I thought it was, because right now Microsoft's very specific about not just it being in preview, but it only applies to certain apps and certain resources. And when you look at the docs, I was like, that's actually not really going to apply to my scenario. I'm not sure whether I've misunderstood the docs or they've just improved it since and haven't updated their docs, because they do say it's in preview and they are continually making it better. I think maybe they've improved it since and haven't fully updated all the things in the docs they're doing yet. But I found it was seemingly blocking the graph API access more generally. So I wasn't necessarily using the apps or resources it mentioned, but whenever I was trying to access the graph API, it was blocking me. However, it doesn't apply to everything. So I'm going to show you here what I did. What I showed you before was using the Teams app. I used that just because it had quite a nice reply URL. I could use that, the legit Teams one that you saw as it started loading Teams in that window. But also it has pretty wide-ranging scopes in the graph API for common things like email access and file access and those kind of things that you'd want. The original consent fix attack we saw actually using the Azure CLI app and targeting like the Azure management interface. So I kind of switched back to that example. This is from Entroscopes. This is actually quite a good resource if you want to look for things that might be viable for checking different combinations. But ultimately, I'm going to show you this now. So first of all, I'll do the Teams one, and I'll show you what happens now we've got token protection enabled. Effectively, that's what happens. Well, it just comes and says, sorry, we've got token protection enabled. It won't do it. I can do it again. Same thing. Now, off screen, I'm going to quickly change the config of this app, and you'll see me refresh in a minute. And we're going to switch to using the Azure CLI app. I'm going to refresh now, and it's going to be different. We're going to have a different reply URL as a result because we're using the Azure CLI app. So we're going to go back to localhost like the original attack. So you can see that there. I drag and drop. And in this case, it still worked because it didn't come under a resource that was protected by token protection. Now, in terms of post-exploitation here, I'm showing you something really simple. This is almost like a hello world, who am I example. I'm calling the Azure Management API to just say like which tenants are present. It's obviously not particularly interesting. I kind of ran out of time. You could probably set up loads of VMs and start showing how to execute commands through them. There's lots of interesting things for sure you can do through the Azure Management API, but this is just a basic example. So I've obviously showed you some of the limitations of this. I also kind of implicitly along the way showed that there's certain kind of gotchas with conditional access policies too. And really it comes down to your environment. But there's a couple of other things I ran into, and this was a mistake I made myself twice while testing this. So I figured, I don't know, surely someone else is going to do the same thing that I did. For compliant devices specifically, if you set it to report only mode, which is a great feature of conditional access policies because you can trial something new without it blocking, review the results, tweak until you're happy, and then put it into blocking mode, right? It's a great feature. But this is what happens when you switch it to report-only mode. So you take that template, you put it for everyone, you do this. And I just without really reading it, I think clicked through this the first time I was doing it in a lab environment, and then started getting really confusing results for a while. And ultimately, it's saying that on other platforms, even in report-only mode, it might start prompting people for client certificates, and so it's suggesting you do this to avoid problems, and it defaults to that option. And yeah, I basically saved it like that, and then for a while I was really confused about like some conflicting results. If you do that, effectively, you've completely hamstrung your policy, because if you're doing attacker things, you just do it from a non-Windows platform, and then it bypasses everything. And then even when I discovered my mistake and set it back, I accidentally reapplied it that way once while doing something quickly too. So I'm sure there are other people out there that have made this same mistake. It can't just be me. So be careful of that too. What else is Microsoft doing? They are doing a lot in this space, really, to be fair. Like, device code flow is actually going to be blocked by default in new tenants. Obviously, that doesn't impact the rest of us out there, but at least for new tenants, they're going to be doing that soon. Passkeys, although they don't apply in authorization phishing, that's still a good thing. They're pushing forward that too. Token protection, they've already said they're going to improve over time. And at some point, I'm sure it'll leave preview and people might start using it more. Maybe they'll even make it default, I don't know. But they also seem like they've been doing a little bit of attack surface reduction on consent fix. So like, I don't know if this was the case before or not, but it feels to me like when I'm looking through the results, they've started restricting the number of apps and number of reply URLs that you can use, and even certain things that use like native client callbacks. Maybe this was the case already, but it just seems a bit suspicious that some of these require this reply URL, and then when you go to it, it renders in big text, by the way, this might be a phishing attack, which doesn't stop the attack, but at least it gives the user an extra chance. So they're definitely doing a lot of work in this space, right? Okay, so quite a lot of content there. What does the future look like? I think given we've seen like 30 device code kits go from 0 to that in a matter of months, I can say quite confidently we'll carry on seeing more. If there's any attacker in the middle threat actors that haven't already introduced their own device code phishing kits, I can say for sure they will do eventually too. It's obviously being very successful. I also think there's a very good chance of wider consent fix criminal adoption at some point. It's clearly on the forums, it's available for sale, it's a very effective technique. I think it's just a matter of time before someone starts using it at a larger scale. I think we'll see more general abuse of OAuth in other attacks. So like in years past, I've spoken about this in regards to other layers. Like this has been entirely initial access layer focused, right, this presentation, but OAuth is actually really interesting and powerful in the persistence and lateral movement phases of attack. I don't have time to talk about that in detail today, but I'm going to link to things in a sec. But I think we might see more of that there, because that's at the authorization layer too. And generally, I think we will see more non-Microsoft targets here. Like device code phishing in the past has actually been used against Salesforce. Maybe GitHub will be next. I don't know. I think just in general, everything tends to start on Microsoft, and then it starts moving its way out to other vendors too. So I think they are kind of my general predictions for the future. I think for a defender, the advice is going to be that you need to test and verify your defenses really against these attacks. So like, it's not a blanket tick yes or no. Like you really need to sort of purple team these things, and particularly where it comes to Microsoft and conditional access stuff, it's so dependent on your environment and your configuration. Like real world conditional access policies can be extremely complicated with all sorts of exceptions and other things, and really you just need to be able to go through iteratively each of these attacks, test them out, see what works, see where your vulnerabilities lie. And I think the other thing is like, I think this is a good opportunity to update security awareness training. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of security awareness training and phishing simulations and things. There's only so much effectiveness they have, but ultimately we spent a long time trying to convince people not to put passwords into the wrong sites, right? Or to run weird executable files. Actually, that's quite hard though, because people are supposed to use their password every day to log into things, and you're trying to explain to someone that's maybe not necessarily technical when it's good and when it's bad. But if you look at these things that I've shown today, although they are, they don't seem overtly malicious if you've not been educated about them, the reality is that these things aren't particularly normal things to do. Like device code auth is legit, but it's actually, more rarely used. Consent fix is obviously not used at all. So if you train users about those things, I think it's easier to then spot, because they won't be expected to do these things in legitimate cases so often. So I think it's definitely worth considering adding these things into programs like that. And yeah, so beyond that, say I released this about 3 years ago. It's kind of a MITRE-inspired framework called the Browser and Identity Attacks Matrix. It used to be called the SaaS Attacks Matrix. We renamed it after we gradually expanded the things in it. Yeah, if you're interested in the space more generally, check this out, because it's kind of intended for red and blue teams. And in particular, when I said about moving to the persistence and lateral movement sort of vectors, here's a blog post I put out a few years ago that's a really interesting sort of take on abusing OAuth to make a very stealthy persistence vector post-compromise. So like, I think those things will become more common too. So obviously today was initial access focused, and initial access is always the most interesting area, but actually persistence and lateral movement in real world compromises can be one of the most important components too. So do check that out. And that's it. Thanks for listening. Any questions? Go for it.
But when one of these happens, what does it look like on the back end logs wise? Is there something you could turn into there from a defense standpoint?
So yeah, so the question's about like what do the logs look like in the back end. With device code flows, you can see that an authentication method is using the device code flow. The question mark is differentiating the good from the bad. But because it is rarer, you definitely can have a better chance of looking through your logs there and identifying scenarios that look more likely to be malicious. So it is worth doing that. For the consent fix, to be fair, I haven't looked at the log side as much. Off the top of my head, I can't think exactly what that looks like compared to legit flows right now. There's probably some information in other people's articles that wrote about this when we first put out the blog post, but yeah, just off the top of my head, I can't really answer that one, sorry. Yeah, so like you will see, yeah, so you would see some sort of login for that. I guess it's just whether you can tell how easy it is to see the difference between a legitimate sign-in like that and whether someone's just stolen the token. That's the bit where I'm a little bit fuzzy right now. Yeah. One more question?
Have you seen any legitimate instances of the drag and drop the URL used, or is that a blanket, this is a phishing?
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of anything legitimate I've seen there, no. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, everyone.
Morning, everyone. How are we doing? Everybody is sleeping, not properly caffeinated. We're okay? We're okay? Okay, all right. Well, welcome to B-Sides Las Vegas Ground Truth. This talk, reheated leftovers, are making us sick, how old data breaches are causing new problems. So I think it's always very exciting when we have a data privacy and lawyer in the house. I think I'm interested to hear what Anthony has to say in his perspective. Just a couple quick announcements before we begin. Sponsors. None of this is possible without our sponsors, so we'd like to thank especially our all-in sponsors, which include Run Zero and SEMGREP. Our Double Down sponsors, we've got Panther, I don't know if you saw the cute stuffed animal, awesome, and Nudge. It's our support along with all the other sponsors and donors and volunteers that make this event possible. Cell phones, quick reminder, this talks are being live streamed and recorded, except for the Sky Talks, of course. As a courtesy to our speaker and the other audience, we ask you to check to make sure your cell phones are set to silent. We do have a microphone in the works, so if you have a question, please use the microphone so the audience and YouTube can hear you. It's at the back of the room. And as a reminder, B-Sides Las Vegas photo policy prohibits taking pictures without the explicit permission of everyone in frame. These talks are all being recorded except in Sky Talks and will be available on YouTube in the future. With that, let's get started. And we'd love to welcome Anthony Hendricks. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am super excited to be here presenting Reheated Leftovers Are Making Us Sick. So my name is Anthony Hendricks. I am a cybersecurity attorney based in Oklahoma City. So while I am a lawyer, I am not your lawyer, and this presentation should not be considered legal advice. Instead, think of this as a conversation between friends, but if you need legal advice, please, please, please find a local lawyer that can help you. I also host a cybersecurity podcast that focuses on exposing underrepresented groups to the field of cybersecurity and data privacy. So what are we going to be talking about? Well, we're going to be talking about why Americans hate leftovers, right? 40% of us despise them, right? And according to the CDC, they are making us sick, with 48 million people getting sick every single year because of the leftovers that we have. And not to be outdone, cyber criminals are doing the exact same thing. They are taking old data breaches and causing us new problems. So what are leftovers? Leftovers are previously compromised data, is credentials that were exposed in breaches years ago that are later repackaged and used in new kind of exploits. And so while AI and zero-day vulnerabilities get all of the headlines, leftovers are really one of the things that are taking off in the recent couple of years. So let's talk about our agenda. So we'll first start talking about some cybersecurity trends. I'll talk about a little bit of cybersecurity law. Cybersecurity lawyer has to talk a little bit about law. Then we'll talk about leftovers, and then we'll talk about why they work, before talking about ways that we can kind of avoid them. And then if we have a little bit more time left, we'll talk about how Oprah, yes, that Oprah, can make all of us a little bit safer. All right, does that sound good? All right, so let's go. So cybersecurity trends. So last year we saw a record number of data breaches, right? So we had an increase in the number of breaches, but actually a slight drop in the number of people who received notices in the mail. So what was the reason for this increased number in cybersecurity issues? Well, one of them was supply chain attacks. Another issue is reheated leftovers, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail, and then throwbacks along with a sprinkle of AI. So those are the things that were kind of driving that increase last year. So a friend of a friend had a breach, or supply chain attacks, or vendor breaches. And so this is where a third party that you have a contract with or relationship with has a cybersecurity incident, and it impacts the information that you provided them. And so supply chain attacks have doubled between 2021 and 2025. So let's look at a real life example. I love to use examples from the real world, but every time I use examples, people will come up to me afterwards and say, hey, Anthony, why did you use that example? Hey, Anthony, why are you picking on that company? And I am not picking on anyone. Instead, I am following what I like to call the Jay-Z rule. So what exactly is the Jay-Z rule? Well, Jay-Z once rapped, Hove did that, so hopefully wouldn't have to go through that. So hopefully, learning from the example of Premise Bank, hopefully none of us here will have to go through what they went through. So let's talk about what happened to them in 2023. So the bank sent out notices in July of 2023 about a data breach that impacted a number of their customers, their social security information, taxpayer IDs, but they actually didn't have a breach. It was one of their vendors who had a cybersecurity issue. And so one of the consulting companies that they used MoveIt, and MoveIt had those issues. And so now the bank had to send out notice to their customers, not because of something that they did, not because of something that their vendor did, but something that their vendor's vendor did. Now we also have leftovers, which were one of the kind of primary drivers, and we'll talk about that in the next section in more detail. And then we have this idea, what I like to call throwbacks. So 40% of vulnerabilities exploited by attackers in 2024 were from 2020 or earlier, and 10% were from 2016 or earlier. And so this is a trend where our criminals are using old vulnerabilities that there's a patch for, that people just simply haven't applied the patch. And they're using that to access our information. So let's look at another example. And so we're going to talk about LexisNexis. So earlier this year, LexisNexis announced that 2 gigabytes of data was stolen from them by attackers. And according to the attackers, they were able to get in through an unpatched vulnerability in the system. And the patch for the vulnerability was released in December of 2025, and the attackers didn't gain access until the end of February. So during that period of time when that patch was available, they could have patched their system, but they didn't, and so they used that vulnerability to get inside of their system. And so all of this is causing us expensive problems, right? There is a ton of cost when it comes to data breaches and cybersecurity issues, with the average cost being over $4 million. If you add remote work on it, you can add an extra $1 million. If we're just looking at the United States, that number reaches up to $10 million. So these are big numbers. And so cyber kind of risk equal legal risk, right? There have been a ton of lawsuits that are filed by people who were impacted because of cybersecurity issues, along with regulators filing lawsuits. And so anytime you have cybersecurity issues, you have legal consequences. And so more and more lawsuits are filed. In 2024, there are almost 1,500 lawsuits, data breach class actions filed against companies who sent out notices to consumers. And because the number of these lawsuits have increased, they have also increased not just because there's more breaches, but because of the changing kind of attitudes of plaintiffs' lawyers. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. So in previous years, what would happen is a class action lawsuit was reserved only for those big data breaches that were all in the news all the time that you kept hearing about. Now, it's not uncommon for a lawsuit to be filed against a company where it's a smaller breach, where it's less people who were impacted. And so you may be saying, well, so what, right? People are victims, their information was exposed, they should just be able to sue. Why do we care so much? Well, let's look at a real life example. So Wilson and Company, they're an engineering company, and they, in April of 2024, suffered a data breach, right? And it wasn't like one of those big mega ones that were in all of the headlines. It was less than 2,000 employees whose information was kind of impacted. And you may be saying, well, big breach, minor breach, doesn't matter. They're victims, they should be able to sue, right? The problem is that when we're seeing a lot of these lawsuits, the victims aren't the ones that are getting paid. They're not being compensated for what's happening. So let's look at what happened in that lawsuit. So there was a settlement, and the settlement provides for out-of-pocket expenses of up to $10,000. So that sounds like a significant amount of money, right? $10,000 available to victims. Well, you have to have proof that you spent $10,000 responding to that cybersecurity incident. And so most people aren't going to have receipts. Like, they're not going to be able to cobble together $10,000 worth of proof. So instead, most people have to just sign up for that payment where you don't have any proof. And that was $25, right? So they get $25. but it was actually capped. And so that meant that the amount of money that's available to victims was capped at $20,000. So that meant about half of the people could maybe get the $25. And then everyone else, right, there wasn't enough money available. You know whose money wasn't capped? The plaintiff lawyers, right? They got all their money. They didn't have a cap in there. And so that was kind of the consequences of these lawsuits, that we're not really helping the victims as much as we think we are. And so all of this leads to higher premiums and more stress for all of us, right? More and more cybersecurity incidences means more people seeking coverage, and that leads to higher premiums and more costs for all of us. And so all of this is leading to bad consequences for every single one of us sitting in this room, right? Medical professionals have recognized that the consequences of a cybersecurity incident is similar to PTSD, right? A lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, paranoia. It leads to stress, hair loss, weight gain. And so we're all sitting here depressed, bald, and angry because of cybersecurity issues, right? So let's talk about reheated leftovers. So leftovers are causing us chaos, right? There are previously compromised data that's used. There's stolen credentials online that are used and repackaged by our cybersecurity criminals for new entry points into your system. But unlike other types of exploits that are kind of focused on newly disclosed breaches, instead they're part of ongoing attacks, right? And so that means that the use of leftovers, the use of these previously compromised data is really under the radar, right? According to Verizon, 22% of incidences in 2025 started with a compromised credential, but not all of those were kind of based off of your previously exploited data, your leftovers, right? Leftovers can be used as part of credential stuffing, part of account takeovers. They can be used to further fraud and impersonation. So they can be used in a number of different ways. And so you're not going to see a ton of headlines the way that you would see a headline for a ransomware attack when previously compromised data is used, which means that they're under the radar, which means it's harder for us to have kind of those important conversations about how to protect ourselves. And so you may be saying, hey, you know, I think this is just a password issue. This is just the same password problem we've had for years and years and years, right? We've kind of seen the headlines of, hey, there was a simple password, it was exploited by bad guys. What makes this idea of leftovers different? Why are we sitting here listening to a cybersecurity lawyer talk to us about this issue? Why is this important? Well, we're kind of at a perfect storm, right? Because we are at a situation where a problem that has happened years ago has finally kind of reached that tipping point. There are so many credentials available online, and the credentials that are available online now are actually better passwords, right? So we've seen the headlines from years ago where there was the big Yahoo breach and there were 3 billion passwords, but those were bad passwords, right? A lot of them wouldn't be passwords that you would be able to use to open up an account right now, right? Because they don't meet the requirement for complexity, for length, for a number of different factors. But now the passwords that are available online are better passwords. They're the type of passwords that you would be able to use right now to set up an account. And so now we are dealing with better passwords, which create a bigger issue for us because we've been really, really good at saying, hey, everyone needs to create more complex passwords, right? They need to be this many characters long. They need to have numbers. They need to have special characters. We've been very, very good at that, right? And so now the data that's available are passwords that are long, that have special characters, that have numbers. And so now we have better things for our criminals to use for these new exploits. So let's look at a real life example. So earlier this year, the French Ministry of Finance announced a data breach that impacted the bank accounts of 1.2 million people, right? So what happened? What was it? Was it a ransomware attack? Was it a complex 0-day? No. It was an old password that someone used at their previous government job that was exposed, and they decided to use it at their new job. and that allowed our attackers to get into this government system. All right, let's look at another example, and let's play a game that the young people play called We Listen and We Don't Judge. So I'm going to give you an example, and we're going to listen, and we're not going to judge. So in July of 2023, KMP, a transportation company, was a victim of a ransomware attacker. But the attackers were able to get into the system because of a previously compromised password that was leaked online, and using that credential, our ransomware gang was able to get into their system, and the company didn't have the money to pay the ransom, and so all of their data was taken and destroyed, and as a result, they were not able to operate, and because they weren't able to collect money, they weren't able to do any businesses, they missed a number of jobs. They unfortunately had to shut down, all because of a password that an employee used that was exposed, and they knew that a number of people's passwords had been exposed. They just didn't force them to change their passwords. But again, we listen and we don't judge. All right, so why do leftovers work, right? Well, the simple answer is more leaks, more opportunity. There are a ton of stolen credentials available online. The volume has increased by 160%, and these are all more recent passwords. These aren't those older passwords that, aren't useful right now. They are the more recent ones that are a little bit more complex, that fit with what we're doing right now. And according to Verizon, 19% of all authentication attempts on major platforms are actually not genuine users, but people who are attempting to access using credential stuffing. And so we are at that perfect storm. But the real problem, the real reason why this works is us, right? We are the problem. And that's a good thing, because that also means that we are the solution. So some of it is that we focus on only half the problem when it comes to passwords, right? Organizations are great at requiring you to have what they consider complex passwords, right? They are great at saying that you cannot create a password unless it is so long, unless it has so many certain characters in it. We are very good at that, but we aren't focused as strongly on password reuse or just slight modifications to older passwords, where they say, okay, now you need to update your password. I'll just use my same password and put 1 at the end and I'm good to go, right? And so we're not good at that. And some of it is because of the policies that we have in place. We have a policy that says every 6 months, everyone needs to update their password. What do you think you do if you got to update your password every 6 months? You're probably just going to take your old one and add a character at the end that allows you to get back into the system. We also focus on technology and not the psychology surrounding it. And so when we talk about passwords, it's easy to begin the conversation with saying, hey, we're going to have password managers, we're going to have multi-factor, we're going to have a passwordless system, we're going to have passkeys, but we don't talk about the psychology surrounding adoption of technology, right? Oftentimes when people present new technology, people are reluctant to embrace it. And so we're not kind of having the conversation about why people will sometimes just reject these new solutions, even though they're going to be super useful for you and your company. So we also don't have a conversation about why we reuse passwords, right? Why do people reuse passwords? For some people, it's convenience. For sometimes it's just fatigue because it's just constantly telling them that they need to update their passwords. But according to a 2024 computer and security study, one of the main reasons is memory anxiety. People fear that they're not going to be able to remember their password. And because of that, they're just like, all right, I'm just going to use that same password because my big brain won't allow me to remember all of that. And so people are anxious about their memory and their ability to remember things, and that impacts what they do and the decisions that they make. Also, we don't teach risk. Right? When we talk about passwords, the conversation is you need a strong password to protect a specific account. And when you have those conversations, it means that people in their head are saying, all right, so this account is important and this account isn't as important. So we'll do a good password for this one. And then for all these other accounts that aren't as important, we can just reuse the same password because they talked about the importance of having a strong password for this particular work account. But researchers at Carnegie Mellon found that when examining the use of password managers, they found that we are terrible at understanding risk and determining what is the more important kind of accounts. When users understand that recycling or using slightly modified passwords is risky behavior, they still continue to do the bad things. Why do they still do this? Well, researchers have found that people underestimate the risk associated with these bad actions, right? In interviews conducted as part of that study, people would say, well, nothing bad has happened to me yet, so it probably means that I'm okay, right? Because there's not a headline that specifically says, oh, we got into the system because Anthony had the bad password. And because people aren't seeing this, they're saying, well, nothing bad has happened to me yet, and they continue to make these bad decisions. So let's talk about some ways that we can create kind of fresh meals, ways that we can address kind of leftovers together. So it's not all doom and gloom, right? So while the world is a scary place, there are some things that we can do right now that will make us all a little bit safer. So everyone needs to kind of just keep their head up. So we should focus on not just technology, but also adoption, right? Technology only works if people use it. According to research from HBR, when companies invest in new technology, there is immediate pushback. And we've probably all seen it at our job. When we roll out a new piece of technology, people are like, hey, I don't like this because it changes what I'm supposed to do. It adds an extra requirement. And so instead of just rolling out a piece of technology and saying, hey, everyone's got to use it, you should focus on telling the story to employees about why it's important that we're doing this, right? Storytelling is one of our greatest tools. It allows people to kind of see a different perspective and be more willing to embrace things. We should also incentivize adoption by measuring it, right? We measure all types of things. We evaluate all types of things when it comes to employees and their work, right? You should have a technology adoption score, how willing they are, how quick they are, how often are they going to trainings for these new pieces of technology, and give them points for that, give them rewards for that when it comes time for compensation. We should also focus on short-term value. The human brain is programmed to evaluate rewards in the near future as more valuable as things later on, right? And so what we should be doing is highlighting quick wins that we get from people using the new piece of technology that we're incentivizing. And so it can just be something as a newsletter saying that, hey, you know, someone was able to use their password manager and transition their passwords pretty easily to that system, and they were able to have logins and successful, and they don't have to call us, and just simple everyday wins that you can just talk about because people, when they see immediate value, they say, okay, this is good because it's going to save me time, it's going to make me a little bit safer, or it's going to be helpful to me. Then next we need to do is we need to train better. And I always, in all of my presentations, when I talk about training, I always use this picture of LeBron when he is teaching Austin Reeves about a play. And you can see Austin's face. He is very, very, very confused because training is a long process and it doesn't always click for people. But then we see the picture at the bottom, and this is Austin Reeves the next year teaching another young player how to do something. And so if we are effective at training people who are initially confused, they can learn and they can be the people who are teaching other people. And so we need to focus on helping people understand risk and allowing them to kind of make better decisions and to embrace the technology that we are using. So what does risk-based training kind of look like, right? We aren't good at identifying what actual risks are. So our training needs to fill that gap. In studies on why people don't use password managers, one significant factor is people didn't understand the real risk in not using these password managers. So using examples pulled from the headlines the same way that I was using examples from the news, if you use real-world examples, people are more likely to not only remember what happened, but also learn from it. So we also need to address fear and anxiety. right? People have a lot of anxiety connected with not remembering passwords, right? And they fear that they're not going to be able to remember their passwords, so they're just going to use that same password over and over again so that they only have one or two things that they need to remember, right? The problem is that people are actually better than they think at actually remembering passwords. And despite this, we don't often frame passkeys or multi-factor or password managers as ways to help people kind of reduce this fear and anxiety. You should be framing this as, hey, this will help you so that you don't have to remember. You don't have to rely on your memory. All you have to do is remember kind of one master password to get into a system. So the next thing we need to do is stop spreading rumors when it comes to passwords. Numerous people reuse and modify their passwords believing it will help them remember their passwords. And we need to stop this rumor because it's not true. The human memory theory would suggest kind of contrary to this. And so interference memory theory proposes that recalling a specific memory may be confusing when other similar memories are stored. And so what does this actually mean? It means that remembering bad passwords is actually harder than remembering kind of new, distinct passwords. So remembering a bunch of reused or slightly modified passwords is actually harder than remembering a unique password. A 2025 computer and security study found that when dealing with a large number of passwords, which is the number of passwords that most of us actually have, it actually becomes easier to recall unique passwords than those bad recycled ones that people think will be a lot easier, because as we get more numbers, our brain just works in a certain way that allows us to remember these things a little bit better. The next thing you need to do is put it in writing. 47% of small businesses lack cybersecurity policies. And depending on who you ask for, the number of companies that don't actually have password-specific policies are either a small percentage or a pretty significant, depending on the source that you look at. So how can you expect people to be better at playing the game of cybersecurity if you don't have the rules of the game available? So what did we learn today? Well, people forget about half of all new information within an hour of learning it. So it's not uncommon for someone to attempt to remember what happened. They may ask you after this conference, hey, you were at BSides all week, looking at kind of the schedule. Some guy was talking about leftovers. What did he talk about? And you're going to be like, I can't recall, but I love his suit, right? And it's not your fault, because after about 6 to 9 new pieces of information, there is a significant drop-off. And so I am here to help with 6 takeaways that we can all kind of look at, so that hopefully when someone asks you, what did you learn from this presentation, you can remember at least one thing. So first, while new tools and exploits garner headlines, criminals are using stolen credentials from years ago. Cyber risks continue to grow, and it is very costly for all of us. Leftovers are one of the leading causes of the increase in data breach victims. 4, leftovers work because of a large number of leaked credentials and our weaknesses in training, missing policies, and fear. 5, we are better at remembering than we give ourselves credit for. 6, better training, addressing fears and rumors, and creating policies are key. So if you want the slides, you can scan the URL code. It'll take you to my website. I'll have the slides up there later this afternoon, but you can scan the QR code so that you can save kind of the website so that you can go on later this afternoon and you can have all of the slides. So I know I'm almost at time, but I promised everyone Oprah, right? And I love Oprah. Oprah is my favorite speaker. And what I like the most about Oprah is that she gives out free stuff. So in that little break in between the previous speaker and my turn, I put something under your seat. So if you can just check under your seat, there'll be one winner of something really, really great, right? No, I joke. I don't have the budget for it, but if you scan the QR code, it'll take you to my website, and there is a free gift for you on the 5 cybersecurity mistakes you may be making. It is absolutely free of charge. You don't even have to give me your email address for it. So when I say it's free as a thank you for allowing me to talk. And so that has been my time. Thank you so much for allowing me to kind of share this.
Thank you so much, Anthony. We just have a couple of moments in between to swap out sessions. Just give us here about 30 seconds. Thank you very much. Welcome to B-Sides Las Vegas, Ground Truth. How are we doing? Oh, you're more lively than the last group. Maybe that's because it was a lawyer. I don't know. I'm just kidding. Sorry, my friend. Just a couple little quick announcements before we begin. We'd love to thank our sponsors, but especially the all-in sponsors, Flair and Sublime, Double Down sponsors, which we've got Escape and Dry Run Security. It's their support along with all the sponsors, donors, and volunteers that make this event possible. These talks are being streamed live except for the Sky Talks, and as a courtesy to our speaker and audience, we ask that please check your cell phones, make sure they're set to silent. If you have a question, we've got an audience mic, so those on YouTube can hear you. Also, B-Sides Las Vegas photo policy prohibits taking pictures without the explicit permission of everyone in frame. These talks are being recorded, except in Sky Talks, and will be available on YouTube in the future. And with that, let's get this started. And I am very thrilled to welcome Dwayne McDaniel to the stage.
Yeah, that's me.
And thank you very much.
Awesome. I have stickers. I'm going to hand them to this guy, and he's going to pass them around. You don't have to get up and walk around. Just pass it down. Take as many as you want. Otherwise, I have to take them back home with me. Thanks for coming to this talk. Get these slides because, well, you'll have a chance later to get them as well, but that's the tiny URL that takes you to these slides because the second half of this is a lot of checklist stuff, and it's the closest thing to a GRC talk I've ever written. So, I am super thrilled to be here at PasswordsCon. Take your picture. That's the last chance before the end of the talk. I have way too much information in this deck, so we're going to move really fast. But really huge thanks to PasswordsCon for letting me speak 3 times this year, which is kind of amazing. If you're not doing anything December 7th through 9th, make plans to go over to Cork and see PasswordsCon as a standalone conference. Thanks so much for being here. I will get to myself a little bit later, but I work at a company called Get Guardian, and I work with 2 of the smartest security researchers I have ever met in my entire life, and I'm super proud and thrilled I get to leverage some of their work. They were earlier this year looking at leaked credentials around Kubernetes related to Shai-Hulud. And Guillaume stumbled across this. They released all their Shai-Hulud related research on our blog. You can go read it if you like. In fact, I highly encourage it. I'll be talking a little bit more about Shai-Hulud later. But one of the things they noticed, or Guillaume noticed, is like there's a bunch of these credentials for Kubernetes in this private-CISA folder for someone with a Yahoo account. And through OSINT, he figured out, oh yeah, that's actually a contractor at CISA who is, for some reason, so we can work at home, bouncing all of the credentials for CISA's infrastructure, like all of it, against a Yahoo account, private-CISA is the repo on GitHub. CISA wouldn't return our phone calls because we're a French-based company. So we called Krebs, and Krebs got us in touch, and they took down the repo, and there has been a congressional investigation, and as a result, actually, I should have updated this. They put out a series of guides that's how to handle this situation. They've updated their security policies, and so there's some good coming out of it. But that's not what I want to talk about. That's just kind of a side quest, and kind of a claim to fame that we got on the front page of Drudge Report with that story. No, this is the heart of the matter. Who here is following all the Shai Hulud and InfoStealer nonsense that's going out there? Hopefully it's everyone's hands because we're a B-Sides at Security Conference. We're going to go through a little bit of this a little bit later. So we'll say exactly what this is, but this is so widespread. This chart is a fraction of what's going on in the world, and this started in April. I'm going to do something real quick. Open source malware account. I have no idea what's going to be there today, but I'm huge fan of these folks because they put out a free site that gets us all sorts of data about what's going on out there. And if I scroll down to yesterday, here we are. OpenClaw versions, Genesis, ZZ Genesis. But basically, this is all. Today's the 4th. Yeah, this is all real time. Let's say it's the 5th. So this is every day. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of packages infected that steal credentials and then further the attack by pushing those credentials. And the target of all this is the developer. So this is always as relevant as it always is. The developers are the heart and soul of everything we're doing, and we need to protect them better. And stuff that we would have never, ever, with a straight face, told a developer even a few months ago, let alone a year ago, now is like, all right, we need to have some serious conversations about how you're shooting credentials and how you do your job at a fundamental level. Otherwise, it's just going to get worse from here. It might be too late. Who knows? But I'm an optimist at the end of the day because I really do believe we have the advantage on our side of the fence as defenders because we have our systems. We understand what we've built, hopefully. So I'm Dwayne. I live in Chicago. I help people figure stuff out. I'm also a co-organizer of AppSec Village. Come see us on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Come experience the pod activities. That's my little section of it, or that I get to set up and help people experience awesomeness away from keyboards for the most part. I work at Gate Guardian. We do credential layer security, know where all your secrets are, but that's not really what I'm here to talk about because it goes beyond that. But credentials is the heart and soul of everything I focus on because if you take any red teaming course, what do they tell you to do? Oh, you get into Jenkins and pop all the credentials and get it in from there. Or you do this and get credentials. Or you dump credentials from your task runners. Or you, whatever it is, credentials is the goal. It's like the heart and soul, the middle piece of the attack framework. It's how you laterally move. It's how we do so much. As our previous speaker said, it's 22% of initial access vectors, but it's over 68% of all breaches contained a credential exploit within the first few moves. We can just look at things like OpenAI and their latest Hugging Face adventures. They compromised 4 different companies with stolen credentials or found credentials along the way out of their path of like 16,000 moves they made over 4 days. But the heart and soul of that was not novel exploits. The novel exploits were just to get to the internet. Once they got to the internet, it was like credentials, log in, do stuff. We've never built this much stuff in the history of mankind. We have never, ever built this fast. These numbers should be astounding to people that we're seeing year-over-year jumps of this much activity, code pushes, issues. And this stops in October. This is from the State of the Octoverse report. A pretty good indicator of how much stuff we're building and how fast we're building it. And we've never connected so much stuff together before. There was monolithic days in the old days where you'd build the whole thing soup to nuts, you ship it, and that's your code. 98% of the code we push today isn't your code. It is somebody else's code service. You're just doing the wiring and we're tying together all of these things in novel ways. We've never built this much stuff. We've never put this much stuff together. How does all this stuff communicate? Well, in the good old days of SOAP and microservices, box 1 could talk to box 2 because you plugged it in with an Ethernet cable. Now, I need this workload to authenticate to that workload, to authenticate to that workload, to authenticate to that workload. How does all of that authentication happen? Credentials. If you're attacking a system, there's only 2 ways in. Really, that's it. Like, you can, maybe that's a broad overcategorization. If you'd like to debate this, I'm happy to on the hallway later. But broadly speaking, you either do things like, anybody recognize, well, actually this is blaster worm, that's pretty straightforward. But does everyone recognize what this is? This is the from Wikipedia. Anybody? Anybody? Buffer overflow. Yep. Or that's a shell overflow, but that's directly, you break the system. The other way is you get the key and you log in. One of those is significantly easier to do than the other, or actually do something with. But it's not one or the other. And this is what we keep seeing from miners, what we keep seeing from the Verizon data, it's what we see from everything along the path, is like, it is do both as fast as you can to get to the goal. And now we're seeing AI do that exactly that. They're doing both as fast as they can. Now, the good news is we have built a lot of defensive systems that as soon as someone tries to break in, we look through code, like static code analysis for like, could it be susceptible to one of these known attacks? Is it a known thing? And we can put up alarm bells around that. So you try to break in, hey, whoa, you're not supposed to do that. EDR is built on this. Like, that's the promise of CrowdStrike. As soon as the device starts doing something weird or something weird happens on the device, we'll knock it down. We'll stop it. We'll give you all the flags you want. But if someone logs into your system, depends on how they logged in, depends on what policies you set up. Have you set up all the right protections? So like, if you saw the first talk in here today, are you tying sessions to devices, to hardware? Maybe. Does anyone, I don't know if you can see it in the back, but has anyone noticed what's wrong in the traffic between the cows and like calling each other? Yeah, there's a wolf in the middle. That's the whole thing. We're not talking about one login. It's like, whoa, who logged into the system? You're talking about an API call among 10 million API calls a day. Are you going to notice that? Did you set up your system to say just catch that? It's much, much harder to detect. It's harder to defend against. It just is. It gets us back to this picture. That's how all of this happens. It's not a novel attack. It's so straightforward and simple. I'm shocked it hadn't happened already and we hadn't reached this apocalypse level. But again, we've never built this much stuff. We've never had this much stuff tied together. Download the wrong version of a package. That wrong version is tagged latest for a little tiny window of time. I take that back. I'm out of order a little bit. I'll get to that. The number of attacks and the rate of attacks keeps going up with the number of credentials that exist. Secret volume and supply chain attacks, this is the map. This is how they map to each other. We're only going to see them increase. The more credentials we keep making and minting and putting out in the world, the more this is going to go up. So Shai-Hulud, how this works is, in this case, it started with TinyColor, controls TinyColor. It didn't start with that one package. You can point to many, many others. This is just where the Shai-Hulud we investigated in 2025, we tagged it back like that's the first time, the first 40 packages infected. It runs, in this case, TruffleHog, which is a cool tool for open source scanning, find all the secrets. What do you do with that? Keep the attack going. Propagate the attack by anything you can publish this attack forward. That's the worm part. Keep it propagating. Go find all the packages you can infect and put the info stealer in that and publish latest. And then someone's tagged it latest, automatic download. Oh no, now they're infected. Meanwhile, ship the credentials off to somewhere else. And we keep seeing this happening over and over again. Shai-Hulud 1 was September, November is Shai-Hulud 2. I don't know. I think they stopped enumerating at this point. It's just a class of attack now, depending on who signed it. There's a bunch of other worms, miasma, Hades, ironworm. Ironworm's written in Rust. That's fun. There's tons of these. I'm not here to like celebrate or talk in depth about the info stealers themselves. This map is a mess because it is a mess. It tries any way it can to exfiltrate and get these credentials. And it's affecting everything and everybody. You might think, okay, that's great for mom and pop little NPM developer, the guy in a basement in Nebraska who's holding up the entire internet with his open source. It is affecting them, but it's also affecting things like Microsoft, where they had to disable all of their repos for a while because they didn't know what else to do. It's that level of panic. Panic in the streets. All right, halfway through. All right, if you've seen me talk before, you know what's coming. I keep talking about credentials is the problem, but I'm always shocked by the amount of people that don't know how widespread this problem is. So if you know what's coming, do not answer. If you've seen this number before, you looked it ahead, please don't be fair to your fellows. But if you don't know the answer to the following question, we're going to play a little quick game for a prize. How many secrets do you think we found added to GitHub in public in 2025? The way this works, my company looks at every new credential or every new commit that hits GitHub public. We look for a secret. If it's got a secret, we send an email to the committer and say, hey, you did this. Don't do that, please. But then we take all the stats from that. We do a bunch of other stuff as a company. We hook that same engine to private repos and other systems. That's what we mean by credential layer. But just in GitHub public, just the year 2025, how many secrets did we see added just in 2025? Price is Right rules, close without going over. Too many is the right answer, but I'm not giving you credit for that. All right. 30 million. Come on, people. We can't know one. 500,000. 50 million. $1. How much? 20 million. 22 million. 35 million. I'm just going to stop and go with 22 million. You guys got closest than anybody. The first day I did this, the other talk, oh yeah, here's your prize. It's a spice blend I make. I won't throw it at you because this one's open. But yeah, seriously, that's the number. That's the, yeah. This has gotten worse over time. This is not something, we've been screaming about this ever since we came into existence as a company. It's grown 152% since we first started putting these reports out. Meanwhile, the population of GitHub has only grown 98%, which is still a very large percent growth. This isn't a new person problem. This is an everyone problem, because this is how we have made things forever. Because what is on that developer laptop? All the credentials for everything they need to do. Oh, the one other last fact, 64% of credentials that we found to be valid in 2022, when retested in beginning of 2026, 64% of them came back as still valid. Yeah, 4 years later. Yeah, but what's on a developer machine? Everything that developer needs to do their job. And things that were common of like, oh, env file on your laptop. In fact, it's .aws/credentials/secrets. Yeah, that's safe, right? Not anymore. Not with this. Not in a world where one bad download of something you trusted for the last 10 years, trivia, check marks, things you trust in your environments that you love, one bad version, and now all your credentials are piped to C2, and the attack keeps going forward. We know that developers' machines are full of things because we've never built this much stuff. We've never tied this much stuff together. And the developer laptop sits in the middle with the keys to everything on it. And all the attackers know this. So it's not just the entryway into the supply chain, it's the target of the supply chain. It's eating itself in the most horrifying way. And then they take those credentials and like log into Cisco or GitHub and got 38. You know, y'all remember like a few months ago, it feels like ancient history now, but GitHub had 38,000 internal repos exposed. Yeah, y'all remember that? That's directly how it happened. Developers using one bad version of something they've trusted for a long time. Or we wanted to test something new over here, and they just happened to pick it the wrong exact moment. That's all it took. Developers, we got to protect them. We really do. We got to remember, if we're not trying to protect the developer, if we're not trying to get them to do better things, then I don't even know what we're doing. All right, I got to speed up. That's ironically, it says that on the screen. The good news, if there's good news around this, is nothing novel is happening with any of this. Everything we've described with Shai-Hulud, it's a worm. Blaster worm has existed since the 80s. Look, it's the same attacks. MITRE is still MITRE. OWASP top 10 is still the OWASP top 10. It's just moving ridiculously fast now. So what do we do? Can we stop and can we match this? Do we throw AI against this? I am arguing no. We go back to basics. And we say in a time where reactions went from 29 minutes for breakout times in 2025, but we've witnessed in the past year, according to CrowdStrike, 27-second breakout times. You don't have time to react. That's not human time to react. Is that human time to have a SOC do analysis, to do something, to throw a switch, to, hey, we'll throw the credential or reset over here. We'll adjust the firewall rules. No, you've lost in 29 seconds. That's the speed. So how do we fight it? Well, again, there's only two ways in. How do we stop this? How do we stop the break-ins, and how do we stop the logins? The rest of this checklist, literally, I'm going to show you things that I am hoping you take, and that's why I want you to get the slides. Go back and have a conversation with your team and say, hey, are we addressing this? The way you're developing, can we move past the fact that we're looking at patches? This is the actual last CVE opened in the Kubernetes official documentation CVE feed, was open on April 10th. Does that feel ancient to anybody else at this point? Like, we're moving so stupid fast, the ecosystem is blurring, and we're still talking about CVEs that were open, like, it feels like 10 years ago? Is there still merit in the CVE system? That's a whole other discussion I'm not getting into from this stage. What I am saying is we have to say, all right, latest is evil. Stop doing evil. 80% of all downloads in 2025 of all packages, 80% of them were tagged latest. You tag latest, what do you get? Oh, you get the latest version that contains the malware. Pen your versions, not just pen digest, pen the actual, or not just pen the version, pen the actual digest. We know this version's clean, use that one. Cooldowns got a lot easier, and we'll talk about that in a second, but you should have a waiting period. A day is probably good at this point. Lock files are your friends. Chart.lock is specific to, the first time I gave this talk, I wrote it for Kubernetes and didn't update it that much since. And sandbox all the things. Install scripts disabled. And I have some really, really good news on that. We have stopped it in NPM 12. We should have a round of applause for that, honestly. NPM have done the right thing. The problem is, they announced this on June 9th, and the new version came out 8 days ago, 9 days ago. How many people run PHP in their in-house? How many people are running PHP 7 in their house, which hasn't been supported in 20 years now? Yeah, that's the problem. Getting all of your developers up to NPM 12 should be a priority right now. How many people were planning on going back to their developers and saying, hey, are we on NPM version 12? Put it on your list. Put it on your list of things you go back and do next week. That's a Monday morning activity. Audit anything you're going to put on a developer machine. Have some kind of way to do it. Now, that's hard. I'm not saying that's easy. Have a burn it down playbook ready. Know that this is going to happen. This is in a world of assume breach. Go back and assume all of your developer machines are breached. What do you do about that? Do you have that plan ready? Do you have that conversation going with your exec team, your security teams, your development teams? I'm not doom and gloom on that, but you have to know that this is going to happen. You have to know that you have to have a plan. But the good news, they're fixing the ecosystem as fast as they can, but you can only version forward. You can't force this on 11. You can't force this on people that are still running NPM 8 out there in the world. We know that for a fact. All right. That's on the developer laptop. All of this still applies to your task runners, to your CI/CD boxes, those weird Linux boxes in the corner. All of it's the same thing. If it's in your purview, if it's got a credential on it whatsoever, all the same stuff applies. Strong 2FA. Again, this checklist stuff. I'm not going to read the whole checklist to you. Oh, yeah, dangerous pull request patterns. Kill all those. Like, look at actions poisoning issue. I'm not going to get into all that today. And sanitize all of your inputs. When was the last time you talked to a developer about sanitizing inputs? Yeah, if you haven't had that conversation, yeah, I don't even know if you work with developers, but if you have developer friends, like, hey, you're sanitizing your inputs, right? Just checking. Because Bobby Tables, man. Bobby Tables. All right, so that's the, how do we stop the break-ins? Because how do we stop the info stealers from getting on the machines? Because that's the break-in part. I mean, it's the you downloaded it isn't really a break-in, but that's what I mean. Like, there's the bad software got to me. So how do we stop the other part? Well, get the hell away from long-lived secrets. That's the short, very short. If you can have that conversation of what to do instead. And that was difficult up until a little while ago. And it's gotten a lot easier for Kubernetes people thanks to Spiffy and Spire, which I'm not going to get into today. But there's an awesome book on Spire, Spiffy and Spire. Spiffy is secure production identity framework for everyone. Spiffy.io/book. It's 198 pages that will change your life. And you'll go from thinking about credentials letting people in with you have a token, you're supposed to be here. It's like someone walking to your house with a key. It's like, you don't ask where they got the key. It's like, oh, you have a key to my house. Welcome. That's how systems have been built up until recently. And now we're moving to a world of people starting to think like, hey, can we verify you are you before you're allowed to even think about doing anything here? Ringing the doorbell, you're looking out. That's the model we got to get to with that. Like we heard earlier, if you're here for the first talk today, your OIDC trust breaks down if people are abusing that or you've misconfiguration on it. Now, good news again. A year ago, Kubernetes announced that for image pulls, they were moving from static secrets to you could implement short-lived, automatically rotated identities for image pulls. And the Kubernetes world shrugged. And I've yet to meet, actually, no, I take that back. I did meet somebody that's been doing this since they announced it, but that was a very small shop. So someone that's actually implemented that at scale. Well, Kubernetes said, okay, oh, that's the book, yeah. Kubernetes said, we got to fix this globally. So now Docker Hub itself and GitHub Actions are saying you can implement this, closing this gap for GitHub Actions because the world is running on GitHub Actions. Docker said, okay, this is how you're going to do this from here on out. OIDC. This is August 1st they announced this. I guarantee your developers don't know this exists. Go back and talk to them. And if you're looking like, all right, this is all great and all, but what should we be building? What should I go and tell them? Because if you just say don't do something, they're going to keep doing whatever they're doing. It works. What we need to do is give them a shining example on the hill, a shining city on the hill that they can say, look, I can march toward that. That seems cool because at the end of the day, it's easier, cheaper, more sustainable, safer, and cooler from a pure throughput perspective. And the one I'm going to point everyone at is Uber. Shockingly enough, I used to use them as an example of what not to do in security because of the breach from Lapsus, but they've changed their ways. They're an awesome team now. But their team wrote this paper, Solving the Identity Crisis for AI Agents. If you read nothing else out of everything I told you, read the Spiffy book. But if you read two things, read this, because they talk about Spiffy a lot in there. They have implemented workload identity for all of their agents, hop to hop. Hop to hop. They can have auditable audit trails of what every agent did, how it authenticated, no passwords, no keys required. It's all token based. And the kicker on this, that you're going to get pushback of like, yeah, but wow, what does that do to throughput? Millisecond, sub 40 millisecond latency for P99, which if you knew what that meant, you'd be jumping up and down and screaming. I ran around the room when I read that. It's like, dude, this is actually faster than doing asymmetric key encryption. This is faster than anything else you could probably do, and it's auditable at scale. And it's not the future. They built this already. You can just go read their white paper and like build it yourself. Stop storing credentials locally. If it doesn't need to be on the machine, get it off the machine. This is a laundry list stuff. This is why I said get the slides. I'll get to that later. Last thing, and then I got to get off stage. Agents are the new insider threat. How are you dealing with credentials for your agents? There's not a great universal global answer yet because this is all brand new. This is the model I'm going to point you to. There's a few other papers I can talk about later in the hallway, but Gentic Mini is a free open source project that gives you a vault locally for your agents, so your agents never ever see credentials. They make API calls through a layer, execution layer, that pulls in the credentials from the vault for them. Agent doesn't theoretically ever get agent access to the credentials, but it's an agent locally. Who knows? If you have opinions about that, I'm actually making a short video project. Come talk in the hallway. I would love to do a 3-minute interview with you about specifically how you think agents should be dealing with credentials. Oh, that's the P99 slide. I got it mixed up. Sorry. I was working on this last night. Way late last night. Doesn't matter. But if you want to talk to me in the hallway about this, remember, this is not slowing down. This is only speeding up. When I first made this slide, this accounted for November. And then it got super busy, and I was like, all right, we got to cut it off somewhere. So we decided April was not a bad cutoff, and this is a simplified version. But the developer is the target. We need to protect them because we've never built this much stuff. I'm Dwayne. Thanks for listening to my talk, but get those slides because this checklist, go back and have this conversation with your team. and maybe we can get ahead of all of this Shai-Hulud and worm nonsense. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. I guess it's good afternoon. Welcome to B-Sides Las Vegas PasswordsCon. And we just have a few announcements before we begin. Very quickly, sponsors. We'd like to thank our sponsors, especially our all-in sponsors. Checkmarks, Vanta, our double down sponsors. We've got Adobe and White Knight Labs, and it's with their support along with all the other sponsors, donors, and volunteers that make this event possible. These talks are being streamed live, except for the Sky Talks, and as a courtesy to our speaker and audience, we ask that you check to make sure your cell phones are set to silent. This talk's 45 minutes. If there's a chance for Q&A at the end, we do have the microphone that I'm holding in my hand. We want to use the microphone so that we can record that for the audience and the recording. Quick reminder, B-Sides Las Vegas photo policy prohibits taking pictures without the explicit permission of everyone in frame. Talks, again, being recorded and will be available on YouTube in the future. So with that, I'd like to very warm welcome to Kenton, and I'll give it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very glad to B-Sides for having me back. I spoke a couple of years ago about how to rotate any type of credential, and I'm doing something totally different this time. So hopefully it's still in the PasswordsCon kind of sphere. But here's our agenda. I've got a quick who am I. We're talking about certificate transparency. I use a lot of abbreviations because it's a mouthful. So CT, certificate transparency. What the basics are as a view over DNS, OSINT, open source intelligence, and kind of how you can start stitching this stuff together. I've got maybe an audience exercise if people are feeling brave and or your experiences line up with my data, which may or may not. I'll do a quick wrap up, including a plea to the community. So if there's anybody here who works for a certificate authority or a cloud provider that also is a certificate authority, I'd love for you to listen to what I have to say, but no pressure. And then we should have time for questions at the end. I talk really fast, so I'm going to try to break at the end of each section and give just a chance to decompress if anyone has a question before we move on, but I'm going to be going real quick. So, okay, my name's Kenton McDonough. That's phonetic spelling of my name, McDonough. I've worked at Viasat. I work at Viasat, a satellite internet service provider. I've been there since 2018 in various degrees of full-time-ness, so I like to think I know what I'm doing, but there's a big world out there. I'm our security automation operations lead for engineering, so that means I do credential management, RBAC configuration and auditing, just-in-time privilege escalation, PKI, SecDevOps, and half a dozen other things that are on here. But today we're talking about PKI. So again, this is not my full-time gig. I dabble when necessary, but as we started digging into some stuff more recently in the public cloud, I started running into some questions about, wait a second, we're issuing certificates that way? And that kind of spiraled into, why does this work this way? So that's where this talk came from. So certificate transparency basics. No math, I promise. If a Merkle tree makes you want to cry, that's the only time I'm going to mention them today. So before you can bake an apple pie, you have to invent the universe. What is a certificate? Hopefully everybody knows what a cert is, but if you don't, or you've forgotten, a certificate is an attestation that something is true based on a trusted third party. So don't take my word for it. This person says I'm right, basically. And these are documents, essentially. In TLS, Transport Layer Security, they have two uses. Attestation for server identity. Usually we're proving the domain name. I am who I say I am. Client identity is abstract. You can kind of put whatever you want in there. And then each side has to curate its own set of trusted certificate authorities, so they decide which third parties they agree on, right, or they'll trust. Certificate transparency is really only relevant for server identity, so all the client auth stuff, we're going to totally ignore that. here's a certificate. If you've never seen one before, you should do this. This is OpenSSL. And you'll see down in there, there's a domain name. So I fetched this for apache.org. And you'll see in here it says apache.org. Cool. So this is domain names, server certs identified domain names. And this is really a component of TLS, basically. When you ask for a server, right, you get back a certificate. And the client does a very basic check. Hey, does the name that I asked for match the certificate that the server gave me? Again, you can set that check up any way you want, but very basically, it's you know, the name I requested, is it in this cert? And there's various places it can be. This is a part of TLS. You can disable it, but why would you want to, right? You probably don't. Browsers basically don't give you an option to turn this off. So like here's a Firefox screen. So you can see if you go to apache.com, you actually get a different cert from something else because it doesn't exist anymore. So it'll tell you the name didn't match. Are you sure you want to do this? You can actually click through it on Firefox. Browsers have varying levels of protection. I also note wildcard certificates kind of make this a little bit more complicated because there's like matching rules. I'm also going to totally ignore those, so throw that out of your mind. So how do I get a certificate for a domain, right? We're still inventing the universe here. First, I need to buy a domain. A registrar will be happy to sell me one and take my money. There are 3,000 plus options that are accredited registrars according to the International Standards Organization that runs DNS, right? So a lot of people that will take my money. Second, I need a certificate authority. And if you look at the CA or the browser forum, there's about 50 members. There's a little bit more than that. Certificate authorities mostly fall into two camps, the people that do certs for the public web and then the ones that do everything else. These are the only ones that we care about here. So before the CA is going to give me a cert, I have to prove that I own my domain, and this is through a challenge. So usually this involves DNS, right? I've bought my domain from a registrar. I can manipulate DNS. I can prove I own it. When the challenge is complete, the CA gives me my cert. So this, I didn't make this diagram. This is what this looks like. So ACME is a certificate issuance protocol. Again, details are irrelevant, but I say, hello, server, I'd like a cert. And they say, okay, here's a challenge, right? Prove that you own the domain that you're asking for. I go to my DNS server and I stick it in there, right? And then I tell the server, hey, it's there, go look for it. It verifies that it's there, says, yes, this is correct, you completed my challenge, and then gives me back a cert. What I've highlighted in red here is kind of the tricky bit, right? So there's 3,000 registrars, there's 50 CAs, right? What happens if the stuff in the red box breaks down? What if they just don't check? Or, you know, they look at the wrong thing, right? Or something gets messed up in the challenge. It's possible that the server can just give me a cert for something that I don't own, right? So this problem is called misissuance, right? There's 3,000 registrars, there's 50 CAs, right? They all audit each other and their standards, but what happens if somebody just does something on the other side of the planet and just gives out a cert for a domain that I own to somebody that's not me, right? How would I even know it happened? I kind of wouldn't, right? This system is whole distributed. So this is where RFC 6962 came in. This is for certificate transparency. So this was technically superseded by RFC 9162, but that's just an implementation thing. So the guts of what we want are in this one. So this defined two standards. The first standard is for certificate authorities to submit cryptographic proof of, yes, I issued a cert for this domain. And that goes both ways, right? I can look at a cert and I can see who issued it, and they verified that they actually issued it, so somebody didn't break in and do it, without their knowledge. But they also can't deny that they issued a cert, so they have proof of this. The second thing is the more interesting thing. There's infrastructure for the general public to audit the proofs. So whenever I look at a certificate, I should be able to look up the proof that's in there and confirm, all the details about it in we'll say a trusted location, right? So these certificate transparency logs are run at no cost by a variety of companies. Like Google is the one that kind of pushed this to start with, but there's a whole ecosystem of people that run these. These things are massive money pits, right? They do not make anyone a dime. They make money monitoring them, right? But they are complicated to run. So you could stand up one yourself, but it is very resource intensive. So it's for the good of the internet, we'll say. So here's what this actually looks like. So the proofs are embedded in the certificates. So here's signed certificate timestamps. You can look at these. So on the left is apache.org again with the Firefox browser. So you can see there's actually 2 timestamps in each one of these for extra safety, basically. They're submitted to 2 different logs. So you can see the first one was submitted to a company called Geomis, and the second one was submitted to Google. There's log IDs, the algorithms, right? It's a standard signature, right? I'm not getting into the math here, but you can look in the actual OpenSSL like X509 output. It's a little bit different. The browser's tidied it up a little bit, but it's a bunch of keys and moduluses and signatures, basically. So the idea is that the client validates the timestamp by computing the signature input, and then they check with the log. Essentially, there's a public key that the log provides, and it should all check out. So this system only works if everyone agrees to require the extension that I just showed you, the signed certificate timestamp. Essentially, the browser or the community needs to say, I won't trust anything that's not been logged so the public can audit it, right? If one major browser or one major application kind of breaks that, right, then we introduce a vulnerability. I can fool people that are using this particular setup. So the browser authority community decided, yeah, we're going to implement this, right? You can disable it. For particular domains, you can do like registry hacks and stuff on Windows, like corporate policies and whatnot to like exempt certain stuff. But by default, it's turned on everywhere. Nothing else cares, right? So that's kind of the first interesting thing, is that this is really a browser thing, right? Curl doesn't care, Postman doesn't care, OpenSSL doesn't care. Like, you have to really torture other applications into looking for these extensions and caring about them. So it's only relevant for browsers. Maybe that'll change one day, but So that begs the question, why are we doing this for every cert in the world that isn't talking to a browser, right? But that's a separate question we'll get to later. Okay, so let's talk about certificate transparency as a view to DNS. Well, I guess first, before I move on, questions. Everyone following? Appropriate speed? Okay, good. So let's talk about inclusion checking versus search. So anyone who's familiar with DNS, you can't like bulk search stuff, right? You can't submit like a wildcard and say, hey, give me every DNS entry that looks like this, right? You can do inclusion checking, which is you can guess a name and the server will tell you whether or not it has it or if it could find somebody that had it. So you get one domain per query, no wildcards, you get exactly one answer. If you want to do a big bulk info dump, that's called a zone transfer. It's really bad. If you're not, if you have a zone transfer happen and you don't know about it, that's a big issue, right? Your database just got dumped. Certificate transparency logs are, by design, big trees of domains that were put into certificates. If they're in a certificate, they passed a challenge of some kind, which means they probably exist, which means I can probably find them in DNS. And you can search these trees. It takes time. They have billions and billions of nodes. We issue like 500 million certificates, I don't know if it's per month or per year or something, right? And that number's only going up as we drop certificate lifetime. So these trees are gigantic. But the takeaway here is that certificate transparency logs provide a searchable system of valid domain names via certificate metadata. Essentially, we built a whole system on top of DNS to allow you to search it, basically. So how can you interact with certificate transparency logs? There's basically two ways. You can do what I call a historical search, which is you can look through the history of everything that's ever been issued that you have access to and look for things that you want, right? That's an O of N operation. Basically, the trees aren't structured for like searching. They're structured for quick inclusion checking. Kind of like DNS, but you can do this. And there are services that people have stood up that do this, right? You can just drop a domain in and they've built a database out of certificate transparency logs and they'll return you an answer really fast. You can also do what I call a live issuance search. You can just tune into the fire hose of certificate transparency logs. You can watch the trees being built and just look at every domain that's being added as it's being added. So you don't get the historical context, but you can keep an eye out for things that are coming in and you can set up like filter patterns. So let's talk about aggregators real quick. There's a couple of free ones. So DigiCert runs this service called crt.sh, and there's a company called SSLmate, which is in the CA world. They run a thing called CertSpotter. Yeah, they ingest these CT logs and they build databases out of them so that you can search things faster than scan the entire tree starting from zero. Free means slow. They've continually taken resources away from these actually over time, and I imagine it won't be too long before crt.sh either just gets totally dropped or they move to a paid service of some kind. Like you try to search it is really hit or miss. You'll get rate limited by anything. You ask for too many records, it'll just drop you, right? CertSpotter's a little better, but something to keep in mind is that the aggregators don't necessarily watch every certificate transparency log. There's tons of them. So, you might not have an aggregator tuning into the one that you care about at this time. Here's what crt.sh looks like. If you've ever seen it, it's a pretty basic web front end, but you see some of the different options for stuff you can search on here, how they've done this database. You can search by who issued it, subject key identifier, certificate UUID, common name. That's pretty common, right? You can look for SAN fields, right? Every attribute of these certificates is saved in here where you can look for it. I did a search for apple.com. They're a big company. So you can see maybe you can't, but you can see kind of the outputs here. There's an ID in the database, when it was logged, the not before and not after dates of the certificate, which should be pretty current, right? The common name, the SAN fields, who issued it, right? Which CA issued it. Apple is their own CA. They actually own a couple of CAs. So, this is their stuff. But here's an example. You can also see I got rate limited. So my search got truncated here because Apple has so many certs in the system, they won't give them all to me in one go. You either paginate or, tighten up your query. If you want to read CT logs directly, you can write your own thing to parse the trees, but there's APIs associated with them, right? And it's a standard implementation. There's this really cool project I found called CT Hulu or Cthulhu from the Lovecraft mythos. This is by a developer on GitHub. From his README, I will read verbatim. Most subdomain enumeration tools, we'll get to that in a second, they rely on third-party services like CRT or CertSpotter for certificate transparency data. This works great until the service is down or rate limited. You don't want to reveal your target to third parties if you're doing recon work. The service doesn't index the log you need, because not all of them do every transparency log, or you need real-time monitoring, and you don't want to wait for it to get ingested into the system. There can be a lot of hang time before the aggregators will make it searchable because they have to ingest so much stuff into the databases. This is what I did. So we'll talk about my methodology. Let's talk about OSINT. So open source intelligence, things that are public, that's the whole point of this talk. CT logs can be used to discover assets even if they're not even reachable, right? If it's in DNS and it has a certificate, I can find it, basically. It gives you a really neat historical record, too, for old and expired certificates. You can watch the pattern of every cert that's ever been issued for a domain in the logs that you have aggregated. So that's kind of cool. You can see when things move around, too. You can see when, CAs change or a SAN field gets updated and something, a cert is reissued. There's a really neat blog from this fellow whose name I'm not even going to try to pronounce on this topic, but he's a red teamer. I read his summary. Great for enumerating subdomains. There was a talk earlier in the con about dangling DNS, like ghost domains. This is a good way to find them. If you go look up certificate transparency logs, you find everything that's ever been issued. So you can find things that aren't around anymore that still have valid certificate records. Generally, there's 3 kinds of findings. So you're going to find public stuff that's meant to be public. Self-explanatory, right? That's the whole point of this system. This is the least interesting category, but there are some caveats when people accidentally make stuff public. You might find it with a web scanner, but you can see the domain associated with it. Number 2 is public services hidden behind firewalls or virtual hosts that conceal their names. So this is stuff you wouldn't find with a scanner because it's all name-based. But if you can find the names, you can just go right to the DNS and see where they're living. Number 3, references to unreachable private services using public CAs. This is the most interesting area, and this is what I want to spend a bunch of time on, but I think we have a quick intermission.
Yeah, a bunch of time in just a little bit. So you're probably familiar, we do a thing called outrageous speaker requests, and in this case, we had one for a Magic the Gathering card that's called a Demonic Tutor. And now, the Demonic Tutor is an interesting card.
I figured this would be a good one.
So it allows you to search your library for a card, put that card into your hand, and then shuffle your library. And the tagline on this says, "Beware the generosity of demons." There was a small detail here. They wanted the card signed by Daemon Tamer, so it would be a demonic tutor rather than a demonic tutor. And I have signed it, and it says, "The bargain is struck."
Thank you, sir. A long and fruitful partnership.
And thank you.
These guys are the best. You can ask for anything. This is a $50 card, too, by the way. I don't know how to... All right. Okay, so this third category here, references to unreachable private services using public CAs. This is where things get really interesting, and this is where my interest got piqued, because a lot of companies will use public CAs to issue certificates for their private stuff. Because why wouldn't you? It's already trusted on every laptop. You don't have to do anything to it. But the names all end up in the public certificate transparency logs, which means you can find them. And if you're really, really messy, you might be putting your private IP addresses in the public DNS records as well. So I can't get on your network, but I know you have a thing running at this address, with this name, and maybe I can take a guess about what it is. So this is, a cool OSINT bit, I think. And, you can't do anything with this on its own, but you can chain it into stuff. So if I was already looking at a target or I had an in into their network, I might be able to find stuff without even scanning, right? I don't even have to run a scanner. I just know where stuff is. So this is the one that I'm going to spend the most time on. So in case you weren't totally following this process I'm talking about. So let's say left is private internet, right is public internet. I have a CA and a DNS system that's straddling both, right? So I have public and private, and then I have a transparency log that's out here somewhere, right? So I'm registering git.mycompany.com at 10.27.17.100, right? This is my certificate. So I need to put a DNS entry for that, right? And then for the CA, I got to prove that I own it. So I have to make a request to the CA, right? Give me my cert. I have to make a public DNS record. It may or may not be the same. In this example, I've actually made it a separate one, but I make a public DNS record for my git.company.com with my challenge in it, right? There's various ways to do this, but the details aren't important. It doesn't even matter what data I put in here. I just have to prove that I own the domain. But I make that publicly. So, the CA can now see that now. They say, cool, let me log this name, right? It doesn't matter where it's going. I'm going to log it for you, right? Because I'm a public CA and this is what I do. So cool. Before I even get the cert, it's, in the log. All right, here's your cert, right? But we've crossed the plane between private internet for my private infrastructure and public internet because the CA I'm using happens to be a public CA and they just do this. So this was my methodology. So I didn't do anything super sophisticated. I was just looking for stuff like this from companies to see what they were putting out there. So I started a fire hose scan. I just tuned into the CT logs for TLDs, right? So you can write filters for these things, say what you want. I just said, give me .com, .io, and .ai. Why not? .ai is hot right now. I filtered these for domains using DNS to identify records that either had private IPs or NX domain or no record. So I'm looking for stuff that's not available publicly. And then I searched the names that came back for like commercial off-the-shelf technology that, might be interesting. Git, Jenkins, Vault, Grafana, right? Common stuff that companies use. Also, just for funsies, I ran a few historical scans against just well-known domains to see like, okay, what are big companies that have plenty of money? What are they doing, right? Do they do this too? Or is it just us small guys, right? It's small, but... So here are the results. I ran these scans for about 200 hours, mostly just overnights. I went on vacation. I just let it run for a whole week. I picked up 100,000 unique host names across 9,200 base domains. So full host names just involve, the full set. Base name is whatever.com, whatever, one segment up from the base here. 90% of those were, or 97% of those were .coms, 2.7% were .ios, and 0.3% were .ai. Again, I'm pre-filtering only the stuff that didn't have public DNS, right? Or it didn't look like it had public DNS. There's some weirdness in here. So I didn't even keep track of how many total domains I looked at. I threw, so much stuff out. Of these 100,000 unique host names, about 75,000 of them were associated with the top 10 base domains. So I've got some graphs for this. It's kind of hard to follow, but essentially the top 10 domains that kept showing up, they do this a lot. They generated almost the bulk of the, almost 75% of this was from the same 10 companies, basically. It's actually less than that. Because of those 10 domains, 3 of them were owned by Workday.com and 2 were owned by Salesforce. So they just do this at scale, right? So once we cut all that crap out, right, I've got about 5,000 domains left that have private IPs in public DNS. I thought this was really interesting. Most of these are actually Western Digital NAS appliances on people's home networks. So there's, I guess, something when you buy a Western Digital home NAS, you can plug it in and you can say, yes, give me a cert, and it'll generate all of the stuff in the public DNS system, right, in public CAs, but you're only using it privately. So that's kind of interesting. The remainder, once you filter a bunch of this stuff out, it's mostly just random garbage. I have no idea of knowing what some of this stuff is, but there were a few grains of, interesting things that kind of fell out of this. So it's a very low amount of effort, honestly, for what I got out of it. But if you want to look at a graph, this is what it looked like. So you can see Workday owns several of these domains: Workday SUV, Workday SUV Site, Workday SUV Careers or something. Amazon shows up, Amazon AWS, I can talk about that. Heroku and there's another one in here. Yeah, Heroku. There's 2 Herokus. That's a subsidiary of Salesforce. If anybody knows who owns MMSCloudTest.com, couldn't figure anything out. Their whois is redacted. There's a couple others in here, but you see Snowflake, right? EduDeploy, right? A lot of these are service providers that give certs to whoever wants them on their platforms, and they just, they cross that private-public plane. But there was a few interesting things that fell out of here. So before I go into these results, I should check my time. We got plenty of time. This is great. I'm not targeting anybody specifically. If you happen to work for one of the companies that I'm putting up here, that's funny. I just picked out stuff that was interesting. Again, I've no vendetta, nothing against any of this. Anybody work for OpenDNS.com? They're a Cisco subsidiary. They love Jenkins. So they got acquired by Cisco several years ago. They had 56 individual private Jenkins host names that showed up. It was a mix of human names, technologies, and team names. So if you know an Andy that works at OpenDNS, he owns 3 Jenkins nodes, and I know this now too. Andy JCask, Andy Scriptler, and Andy Test 5. There's also Jason, owns a Jason Dev and a Jason Test. Leland has a self-managed instance. They've got on-prem cloud. They've got OpenDNS client SFO1, Umbrella demo. They make a product called Umbrella, or I guess they did. I don't exactly know, but plugin test, right? Just interesting stuff. Anybody want World Cup tickets? Found domains for secutix.com, operates a separate QA and pre-prod environments for sale, resale, and for the playoffs. It seems like it might have been interesting for anybody that was trying to, break into there or, do something with World Cup tickets this year. But here's a bunch of those. CAD, thought that was interesting. I don't know if that was for Canadian dollars for, I guess there were games in Canada, right? I don't know. I didn't watch much this year. But, interesting, right? And I didn't finish checking if they have prod equivalents of all of these, but, it's in here. What do mature companies do, right? So I mentioned Apple earlier. Apple's $1 trillion plus company. Surely they know better. They register a ton of stuff under corp.apple.com, which is their internal setup. That's all exposed in CD. There's a few interesting ones. Anybody know what a smoot is? It's a humorous unit of measurement created by MIT from like a frat pledge that like measured himself against the length of a bridge. Apple runs a whole system internally that has something to do with Smoot. I assume it's like a metrics measurement platform. Maybe it's funny, but I don't know. That popped out. There's a bunch of these. jferrari.corp.apple.com. I thought this one was interesting. I was like, what on earth could this possibly be? Either it's an employee, Jay Ferrari, I don't know, maybe he's related to the company. Apple was doing a car at one point, or they were talking about it, and there was something that came out about, I think it was Johnny Ives and Ferrari collaborating, so it was like, I don't know, but, this popped out. rto.corp.apple.com. So this one got me thinking, is like, okay, if I was an Apple developer and I was watching my own CT logs, could I have caught wind of an RTO policy coming from a name getting registered publicly before anything was announced? Like, I don't know. I'm not an Apple employee, but I'd like to dream. This it's interesting. I work for a satellite company. It'd be cool if I talked about other satellite companies, right? SpaceX, look them up for fun, just see what they've got. Here's some fun garbage domains. I don't know. They're publicly accessible. I didn't port scan them because I'm nice, but there's something here. Then they do a bunch of work in Azure GovCloud. I mean, a lot of people do, but I mentioned earlier about like virtual routing tricks. So Azure GovCloud, and a lot of other providers, they do this like edge stuff, right? Here's a bunch of domains that are all registered at the same IP address. So if you're just scanning around on the internet and you bounce off this IP, you'll get like a gateway failure, it'll tell you it's like azureedge.us, right? If you actually want to know what's there, you need to provide a host header in your request to get it to route properly. So here's a bunch of hosts that, I happen to know are there. So if you plug these in, these are all publicly routable, right? You can just go and, fish around in there, but they all go through the same front door, so to speak. So I wanted to point this out to highlight, the difference between CT log based, intelligence gathering and just blind internet scanning. Stuff will bounce off this, but if you know the name, you can just go right to it. Anybody want to check their company? Viasat. For legal reasons, I'm not allowed to do that. It wouldn't be in good faith, I think. I didn't check with my folks if I could do that or not, but I've been looking at them. Anybody else? I got other stuff. Like I said, I got 100,000 of these, so I did B-Sides. I did B-Sides Las Vegas. Let's see what they had. I got to transfer this to make it come up right. Let's see here. B-Sides was pretty good, actually. B-Sides Las Vegas. Let's see what they had on here. Archive, the main site, which everyone's familiar with. Call for papers. Censor. I didn't figure out what this is, but it's, publicly routable. Again, I didn't scan it because I was being nice, but it didn't load an HTTP session, so there's got to be something running there. Shuttle. I don't know. Probably details about the DEF CON shuttle. Volunteer. Self-explanatory. I don't know. Let's see. Who else do I have in here? I did one for a company called Warmhilt. I don't remember what they make. But I found a Git of theirs, so I didn't show all the Git stuff on here, but they have a Git and a GitLab, which I thought was interesting. So this workflow was this one popped out when I was just scanning, and I said, okay, well, what else do they have, right? I've got your base domain now. What do you got? So they only had a handful of things, right? But, interesting. It's also interesting you can see where, the public good stuff has Sectago on it, right? All the internal stuff is Let's Encrypt because it's free, right? Oh, I guess I can show. Not Apple. Where'd the SpaceX one go? Oh yeah, we can actually. There's actually something interesting for Amazon. Let me flip over to a slightly different one here. Not, I mean, they don't care. Give me a second here to pull this up. Okay, here's raw stuff. Anybody know what a multi-regional access point is? It's an S3 thing. So you can create these and they get their own domains, which are all logged publicly, even if they don't route publicly. So I checked into this a little bit. Amazon's actually pretty good. By default, these are, they disallow anonymous auth and they disallow access from any IP space other than what you give it. But the names are all here. So if you wanted to fish through these and like find ones that have been deliberately misconfigured, you could. Amazon also exposed some canaries in here. Let me filter this again. Clear. Oh, that's a good one. I'll check on that. Yeah, so Amazon.com had some canary in here. Again, don't know what this is. I don't work for Amazon. What do we want? Canary. Let's see. Again, this is just for the 200 hours that I was running stuff. It didn't look like it. Nope. Anyone else got stuff? Anthropic? Nope. Nike. Nike Cloud. Nike Port Pulse. I don't know what these are. I don't know what we're about to get. I can't even read that from here. I don't know. Does this look interesting to you? IAM tools. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, there's some prod stuff in here, and they're private internal IPs. Also CNAMEs, and I set it up to pull, all the records. Sometimes you could get like token, like, part of challenge responses or like tokens or things out of here, but interesting. How are we doing on time? This is probably a good point to move on. Let me take this back. Okay, so I'll move on to my wrap-up. Convenience comes at a cost. Certificate transparency leaks information that would otherwise be essentially private. So caveats there: leak, do you care? Maybe you don't. Private or essentially private. DNS can be brute forced, right? Anything that's in here you can find because it's public DNS. It just takes time. And if you have a word list or you have a really deep knowledge of what the company is, right? You could probably guess out their whole domain space anyway. But especially with long or random subdomains, it takes forever. Domain names are for humans, usually. I mean, we like to pretend that the computers are using them, but computers speak IP, right? Domains are for humans to identify what's there. So it indicates what technology is sitting behind the certificate, right? Because we're pairing certificates and DNS and machines, and there's an intent thing there. And CT allows discovery without any kind of network scanning. So I imagine most people, if they had a breach internally, right? Somebody landed, your EDR might fire, right? You might catch something. If it's a really advanced crew, you might get an early warning, but if they land and they don't scan the network and they know exactly where they're going, if they know that you have a Git and where it's running, or a Jenkins instance or some Grafana, some other piece of technology that they're interested in, right? Would you notice if they didn't scan the network to find it, right? You might not. If you're putting all your stuff in public CT and then public DNS, I don't even need to scan. I can just drop in and, go right to your thing. And you get a good idea of what's there even if you can't reach it. This is a shot from Donnie Darko where he's like tapping the glass with the knife. That's how I felt when I was doing this. I was like, let me in. So here's comes down to my plea. So I spent a lot of time working on certificate transparency. The big thing for me is I don't want to put my public stuff into the public domain, right? Hey, CAs, if you support private intranets and private interconnects and stuff, why do you make me do this? Especially if my only clients are browsers. If I'm standing up a public API and no browser, I don't care if browsers won't talk to it, right? It's for API clients. Why are you making me put, CT logs in here, right? Why are you forcing me to log my names? AWS actually used to have an option to turn this off. They were the only one that I could find that did. They removed it in June of this year, kind of silently. So the original blog post has like an opt-out link, or they have instructions for that. That whole thing's been updated, and they haven't updated any of this. The only reason I know is because somebody else in my company forwarded me an email that's like, hey, my CC logging is being forcibly turned back on, right, for this stuff. Thanks. So after some chats with Google and Amazon and a few others, right, they say, hey, public is for public, right? Anything you put there is going to be publicly logged. It's more complicated for us to like give you an option to turn it off, right? It's, you know, compliance headache, I guess. So if you don't want CT logs, set up a private CA. We all have private CA services. Why don't you just use that? It's like, well, yeah, but now, like, you know, I have to manage the CA. I have to load a key in. I have to distribute the CA material to my laptops and, you know, make sure that all my internal customers have it, right? You know, we're already doing that anyway, or we should be doing it, right? But it's like, why don't you just let me turn it off, right? Give me an option to say, yes, I understand the risk, right? Yes, I understand browsers won't trust it. There may be other problems, right? I don't want it. Signed certificate timestamps also inflate the size of a certificate, which can be wasteful. So if you're in a really resource-constrained environment and you don't want them, you know, the size of the certificate matters, right? You probably don't want them because you're not going to be using them. Post-quantum signatures, I said no math, right? Post-quantum signatures are especially bad for this because the size like massively inflates, or, you know, they get super complex. So depending on what algorithm you take, they're not all chosen. So, you know, I want an option to take this stuff out. As a customer, I don't want it, right? But I don't have a choice unless I do my own thing. So here's kind of my wrap up. Do you know what's in your CT logs for your company or your private website or, you know, your tech stack, your Western Digital NAS appliance, right? If a CA misissued one of your certificates, how would you find out? So contrary to all the problems I've talked about, this system is actually really, really worthwhile for the foundational problem here. I imagine most companies have an agreement with somebody who has an agreement with somebody that's watching out for their domain names. But I don't know. I've run into the problem before where we say, hey, I want to use this domain. And we say, did we buy that? Do we know if anyone's already using it, right? You can do this yourself, or you can pay somebody to do it. You should be watching these things, right? Are you comfortable with the names that your developers are exposing, right? Somebody puts, you know, an actual secret key in one of those, right? Or does something really dumb, like with, you know, there was a talk earlier about emails and embedding like API keys in emails. If you do something dumb and embed a you know, sensitive token into a domain name, right? Might just be out there for anybody to find. I don't know why you do that, but people do all kinds of crazy things. If you were an attacker or an attacker's LLM, I didn't talk about AI at all, but, you know, dump all this stuff into an LLM and see what it says, right? Ask it to do analyses of the tech stack of whatever company you're targeting. What could you learn from this, right? And potentially scary thought. Certificate lifetimes are dropping, right? The public CA forum is, I think, intending to get him down to like 47 days or something. I think Let's Encrypt will let you do 7. If you know exactly when a company's renewing their cert, like clockwork, because you've been watching CT logs and you know exactly the time when it starts, all you got to do is get a little disruption in there at the exact time you know it's going to fire, and you might be able to do something, right? You know, the data's all there, right? I don't want to be an alarmist, but you could learn a lot from this stuff. Go check it. It's free, right? Do it yourself or pay somebody. I don't know. Questions? Thanks. Thank you. I don't do LinkedIn. I don't have a QR code. You can reach me here if you want these slides. Question?
Have you considered integrating this with cyber deception?
Elaborate.
You plant bed or your honeypots in the CT logs to guide.
See who finds them.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a worthwhile technique, I think. If that's a threat class that you're interested in, right? Yeah, just go publish a bunch of domain names and, you know, wire them up to something. You know, you could deliberately seed, you know, vulnerable technology information into, you know, domains and make them public. See who turns up, right?
So this is super basic. For external, we hire one of the big people. Internally, we self-sign a lot, and then we register it with Google. So were you searching Google's registration for all of these? I'm just trying to understand how you found them.
Right. So under the hood here, right, Google operates a variety of certificate transparency logs that people submit to. So of those, you know, 50 issuers, right, the people, 50 certificate authorities, not all of them run their own certificate transparency logs. Some of them submit to others that run them on their behalf. Google happens to run their own, right? So you would need to check. I'm not sure 100% what your setup is, but it might be worth checking if whatever process you're doing to register things with Google or get things signed, if it's resulting in the domain names being registered. I mean, you can also check the certificates, right? If the certificate has a signed certificate timestamp in it, it's in a log. It'll tell you which log, right? So you can go figure it out. That's a good question.
Are you also using this data to feed for like typo squatting on your domain?
That's another good idea there, right? Just checking for typo squatting or interesting domains that are showing up, right? If you're there's a dimension to this I didn't get into, which is I wanted to get a little bit more information about who owns this stuff, right? That can be very challenging because of how Whois is set up. So if you're not familiar with Whois, when you register a domain, you are required, essentially by law, to provide information about who you are and what your purpose is, right? A contact information for yourself. And it's for abuse, right? But we decided collectively a long time ago, putting public information into publicly searchable records, right, that includes like mailing addresses is a really bad idea. So unless you're a big company, you probably don't put your name in there. You use a proxy company, which registers on your behalf and redacts the information and provides a contact address if somebody needs to get in touch with the person behind the domain, essentially. So if you have a suspicion that a domain has been registered, right, but you don't know anything about it or what's been hiding there, right, you could do this, right? So if you were really interested in squashing, typo squatting, whatever, yeah, enumerate them all, right? See what's been registered and what phishing services are running, right? You could do that. Any other questions?
Just out of curiosity, did it change your stock portfolio at all? And have you looked at domains to see whether you should buy, sell, or short?
That's actually one of the classical uses for this stuff is to find domains for technologies that are new and emerging that haven't been announced publicly yet, but have ended up in records, right? And that's a long-standing open source intelligence technique. I don't know how that conflicts with like insider trading laws or anything else, right? If you can, I doubt it, right? Because it's open source intelligence, but. Yeah, so if you really are interested in your stock portfolio, yeah, you could just set up monitors for what are the new and interesting things coming out for companies that you are interested in, right? And see when an interesting new name shows up. These have been great questions. Anything else? Fantastic. Thanks for staying engaged. I was the closer. I think we're all done, right?
Yes, thank you so much, Kenton.